I'd like to call this hearing to order this morning, and this is a joint hearing of the Energy and Power Subcommittee and with the Environment and the Economy Subcommittee, and of course the subject of this morning's hearing is the FY 2017 budget for EPA, and I'd like to recognize myself for 5 minutes. We of course welcome Administrator McCarthy. I went down before the hearing started. I know she's been testifying before the appropriators, and now she's going to be testifying before us. And I suggested that after she finished with us that she go on to another committee and testify there. But there's no secret that there's a really serious division in the country over some of the programs at EPA, certainly the Clean Energy Plan. The administration, we recognize, views climate change as the number one issue facing mankind, and they've moved forward aggressively to address it in the U.S. with the Clean Energy Plan. From my personal view, I think it's being done because of international commitments that the President has made as a result of his Georgetown speech and his other commitments internationally to be a leader in addressing climate change. But I think that it's really come to a head in this country over the controversy of the Clean Energy Plan with the lawsuits filed by, is it 26 states or 27? 27 states filed a lawsuit. And I think that shows quite clearly that there's real angst over the extreme process that EPA is utilizing to adopt this Clean Energy Plan. I might say once again that even Larry Tribe, who is a respected constitutional lawyer, said in some ways it was like tearing up the Constitution. So many people do feel like that, you know, you can address climate change, but you ought to at least follow the law. And other people saying, well, you know, the ends justify the means. But the Supreme Court did stay the Clean Energy Plan by a vote of 5-4. And even under the Utility Act, the Supreme Court ruled that costs should have been considered, and we all recognize that by the time they made their decision, the regulated bodies had already implemented the plan, so it had been done, even though the court said there were some problems with it. And even under the tailoring rule, the Supreme Court issued a decision that called that into question as well. So one of the reasons many of us on my side of the aisle is upset is that we feel like the EPA is being too aggressive and that they've adopted a plan to be aggressive, recognizing that when you have a divided government, the only way that a party can contest it is go to court. And if you go to court, and if you don't get a stay, then frequently, by the time the decision is made and all the court procedures have been exhausted, it's too late. So that's why we are going to do everything we can do to do serious oversight to make sure that the stay issued by the Supreme Court is followed, recognizing that even on that, there's probably different judicial, legal opinions about what can and cannot be done. But we know that the EPA's proposed budget is $8.267 billion, which is $127 million increase over the enacted level for FY 2016, and certainly higher than the FY 209 enacted level of $7.6 billion. But all of us are going to have a lot of questions for you, Ms. McCarthy. As I say, we disagree with you on many things. We respect you as a person, and we recognize that you are a talented person with very strong views. And we have very strong views. And unfortunately, we're going to have a vote during this process, but it won't take long. I think we're only going to have about 30-minute votes. So with that, I would like to yield back the balance of my time, recognize the gentleman from New York for his 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Chair Whitfield and Chair Shimkus, for holding this hearing, I say thank you. It's important for us to focus on the Environmental Protection Agency's budget request for fiscal year 2017. And might I welcome also our Administrator, McCarthy. Thank you for being here to share your thoughts and provide information. And thank you for your sound leadership and your stewardship of many of the programs that make for better results with the environment. Public health and a clean environment are intricately linked, and I strongly believe that these principles support economic growth. Whether it is reducing air pollution, financing drinking and clean water infrastructure, or helping support the cleanup of brownfields for reuse, the EPA plays an essential role in keeping Americans and our environment healthy. I know there are many members who believe that cutting the EPA budget will block the agency from issuing regulations and enforcing environmental laws. But in reality, much of the budget supports state and local governments, either through grants and loans or with information and technical assistance. Cuts to the EPA budget causes additional burdens on state and local governments. The EPA has and will continue to play a critical role in our nation's response to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and addressing the threat of climate change. Despite what some may believe, climate change is happening and needs actions. The Clean Power Plan is essential to this response. I also want to point out that this committee still has not held a single hearing to examine the poor and deteriorating state of drinking water infrastructure around the country. This is an area of jurisdiction that we have neglected, and I find that very troubling. EPA has estimated the 20-year capital needs for this infrastructure at some $384 billion. The American Society of Civil Engineers has graded our drinking water infrastructure a D. Federal support for drinking water systems is primarily done through the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, or the SRF, which was created and last authorized in 1996. Through the SRF, we provide grants to states to administer this funding, giving them plenty of flexibility to address the greatest concerns that they have in the individual states. Since 2003, we have made little to no effort to reassess whether the federal government is doing its fair share. The hundreds of thousands of water main breaks every year, trillion gallons of water lost through leaks, millions of lead service lines, and prevalence of century-old pipes suggests that we are not. USA Today recently reported that nearly 2,000 water systems across all 50 states have exceeded the EPA's lead action level within the past 4 years. That is unacceptable. The federal commitment is simple, not good enough, and we must step up to help states and local communities finance these projects. A majority of the Democrats on this committee have co-sponsored the Assistance, Quality, and Affordability, or AQUA Act, which would reauthorize the Drinking Water SRF at Recovery Act levels and beyond, in addition to making some much-needed updates to the Safe Drinking Water Act. We stand ready and willing to be partners in this effort. For inspiration, we need not look any further than our colleagues on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, who passed a bipartisan surface transportation bill that included a $70 billion transfer from the general fund. We would only need a fraction of that to make major headway in our drinking water infrastructure backlog, that infrastructure which is hidden infrastructure. But sadly, without the need for extension after extension of the Drinking Water SRF, we have forgotten the bipartisan nature of this issue in this committee. It is time to get serious about this committee's role in protecting public health and maintaining our drinking water infrastructure. Every job and every life relies on water. It relies on the commitment that we will demand nothing less than safe drinking water. It is time to come together, recognize this, and take action. With that, Administrator McCarthy, I look forward to your testimony and to working with you to continue our progress in environmental protection. And again, thank you for being here. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. This time, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, who's Chairman of the Environment and Economy Subcommittee. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Administrator McCarthy. Hopefully we can continue to work on coal ash, and as we talked about earlier, getting TSCA over the finish line. We appreciate some of the expertise your office has been able to provide for us to make those decisions. Madam Secretary, there is real pain in coal country, as you know. Market conditions have some effect, but also they just can't keep up with the numerous rules and regulations that they're trying to meet, whether that's CASPER, cooling towers, clean power plan, mercury, MATS, stream protection rule, waters of the U.S. It's just too much that they can handle and have any consistency in planning, and that's why the coal regions of our country are in dire straits. And when you lose a coal mine, you lose all the peripheral jobs, you lose the grocery stores, the gas stations, and the like. We know that you're here asking at least the appropriator for more money. I'm fresh off the campaign trail. I had to tell my folks that you are at 2008 funding levels and at 1989 staff levels. And a lot of my constituents said, well, that's still too much. So we have an education to do. I had to remind them there are some things that I think are important that the agency does too. We have the Superfund responsibilities. We have brownfield reclamation. There are things that we need to do. But the environment out there today makes it difficult for the public to really appreciate the budget requests and the job challenges that our nation is facing right now. But I want to thank you for your service and the professionalism that you have shown. I'll have a couple tougher questions when we get to those, but I know that you're up to it. And with that, appreciate you coming in. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. This time I recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and also Administrator McCarthy for being here today to discuss the EPA's programs and budget. EPA's work is critically important to protecting the health of our communities and our environment. The President's fiscal year 2017 budget funds the EPA at $8.627 billion, a modest increase of $127 million from the fiscal year 2016 enacted level, and this also adheres to the funding level approved as part of the bipartisan budget agreement in October. And I support this increase, but it's important that we all recognize that far more resources are needed to properly address all the environmental issues facing our nation today. A clean environment is essential to public health and to a strong economy. It's also important to recognize that EPA's budget represents a small portion of the overall federal budget, less than 1/4 of 1%. We should also remember that EPA shares over 40% of its funding with the states and tribes to help them implement federal environmental laws and achieve national goals. These funds support local economies and communities big and small. The recent drinking water crisis across the nation demonstrates how important it is to invest in our drinking water systems. I commend the President for increasing the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, or SRF, by nearly $160 million. Our drinking water systems need more funding to help provide clean and safe drinking water to communities. While I'm happy to see this funding increase, I must reiterate that so much more is needed. The drinking water SRF has been underfunded for years. According to EPA's most recent needs survey, $385 billion is needed over the next 20 years to modernize and repair our drinking water systems. We should be working together to make these critical investments to ensure the health of our communities. We've reached a point where essential water and waste infrastructure needs repair and replacement. We simply cannot allow this essential infrastructure to deteriorate further. If we do, we're going to be forced to spend more when a crisis occurs, and the longer we delay, the more expensive it will become to fix. The President's budget also provides an increase of nearly $68 million for climate and air quality related initiatives, which I support. We should be investing in programs that build climate resiliency and reduce the impacts of extreme weather events. I especially appreciate EPA's plans to help communities integrate climate adaptation policies to help them address our changing climate and plan for the future. In addition, the President's budget increases funding by nearly $40 million for the cleanup of Superfund and brownfield sites across the nation. These are vital programs for protecting human and environmental health while also creating jobs and improving the economy. As of March 1st, brownfields programs have created more than 100,000 jobs, and in the first 2 months of this year have revitalized over 4,500 acres of land. While I appreciate EPA's efforts, The remaining Superfund and brownfield sites are becoming more complicated to clean up, and with limited resources, the time and cost to complete this work is extended significantly. With so many people living near contaminated sites, we must continue providing robust support for these programs. Cleanup at these sites transforms them from liabilities to assets that generate needed revenues and economic opportunity. Finally, I'd like to voice one area of concern: proposed cuts to the Beach Act grant program. As someone elected to represent part of the Jersey Shore, I understand the importance of protecting and improving the quality of our beaches and their importance to local economies. I'm disappointed that once again the budget eliminates funding for this critical program, and I'm troubled by EPA's unwillingness to prioritize funding to fight waterborne pathogens or pollutions that affect coastal recreation. This program deserves continued support, and I'll work with my colleagues to ensure adequate funding. But again, look forward to the Administrator's testimony. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. At this time, the Chair recognizes the Chairman of the Full Committee, Mr. Upton, for 5 minutes.
Administrator McCarthy, welcome back. We look forward to our discussion on EPA's proposed 2017 budget. I know that the agency has an ambitious agenda that it would like to put in place before the President's tenure in the White House is completed. But the EPA should focus, I believe, its efforts less on finalizing a wave of new regs and more on getting back to the basic functions for which the agency was created. Improving public health by ensuring the quality of the air we breathe and the safety of our drinking water supply, that's the reason Republicans and Democrats came together in 1970 and created the EPA. It was also the reason Congress passed many bipartisan public health bills like the Clean Air Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act for the agency to administer. However, as the heartbreaking events unfolding in Flint are a sign that perhaps the EPA had strayed from its core mission. Make no mistake, the system failed at all levels that resulted in the lead contamination problems with Flint's water supply. It's clear to me that EPA's poor performance of its duties under the Safe Drinking Water Act were, in fact, part of the problem. I hope that in the same bipartisan spirit that launched EPA in 1970, that we can rededicate ourselves to the basic public health protections that are the reasons that this agency was brought into existence. The most recent example being our bipartisan work to strengthen the public disclosure requirements in the Safe Drinking Water Act. Not only was it a step in the right direction, more importantly, I hope that it provides the reset needed at the agency to focus on doing the tasks assigned to it under the Safe Drinking Water Act, including compliance verification activities. What we're doing now will not prevent damage in Flint, but we owe it to the people of Flint as well as other communities across the country that may feel that may face lead contamination water supplies to sharpen EPA's oversight role in protecting public health. I know many people in D.C. are eager to lay blame on one political party or another when disasters like Toledo, Gold King Mine, Flint threaten a community's drinking water. Regardless of who's responsible, we need to address the crises that those people face. I'm interested in being part of the solution, and I know that you also want to be part of the solution. It's going to take creative solutions, and surely there'll be challenges, and I know that we can put our heads together and put a greater emphasis on problem solving and doing right by the American people rather than playing the blame game, and that's certainly my perspective. And while we're talking about places where we can and should be working together, I want to follow up on what John Shimkus indicated with our committee's reform efforts for the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA. As you know, we worked very hard to put together a bipartisan bill that addresses legal shortcomings in the law. I know that your agency would like to see reform occur in this Congress. I look forward to your support in helping it get to the President's desk. We look to working constructively with you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. The EPA plays an important role in our society of protecting our citizens and our environment. Safe and clean drinking water has recently risen to the headlines because of the discovery of pipes corroded by using contaminated water in Flint, Michigan. This water has permanently harmed their children and shaken people's trust in our public services. This type of occurrence will become more common if we fail to invest in our failing infrastructure, or if we fail to invest in the means to monitor our safe drinking water. Clean and safe drinking water should be a guarantee for every American. It is not only irresponsible but criminal to withhold funds and resources to protect lives. The EPA also have a significant responsibility to fight climate change. Climate change is considered a contributing factor to crop failures and droughts in the Middle East and the African Sahel. Climate change is causing weather patterns to bring superstorms such as Sandy and Katrina. The evidence for climate change is dramatic and growing. The EPA has the experience and science to help us push back on climate change, and they are working on lowering carbon emissions and developing clean energy sources. We need reliable and resilient grid that we can depend upon. And I'm going to take this opportunity to recommend to my coal state colleagues to embrace carbon sequestration before the coal industry collapses entirely. Climate change is also affecting people's health across the globe. Unchecked climate change could lead to 6 million to 7.9 million acres of forest being destroyed by wildfires at a cost of $940 million to $1.4 billion. It could also lead to the destruction of ecosystems such as coral reefs that support economic activity, including 35% of the coral reefs in Hawaii, at an economic loss of $1.2 billion. Both clean water and climate change are huge issues, but ones I am confident the EPA can address and ensure that American lives are protected. Now, I know my colleagues would like to greatly reduce or eliminate the EPA, but what would we have without the EPA? If you have doubts, just visit Beijing or Calcutta, and you'll find out. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and that concludes the opening statements. And so at this time, Ms. McCarthy, I would recognize you for 5 minutes for your opening statement. Be sure and turn the microphone on. And get it real close. Who can fix Ms. McCarthy's microphone? Do we need a staff to work on this microphone?
Got it. All right.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Whitfield, Chairman Shimkus, Chairman Upton, Ranking Member Tonko, Ranking Member Pallone, and all the members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to be up here before you to discuss EPA's proposed fiscal year 2017 budget, and I'm joined today by the agency's Deputy Chief Financial Officer, David Bloom. EPA's budget request of $8.267 billion for the 2017 fiscal year lays out a strategy to ensure steady progress in addressing environmental issues that affect public health. For 45 years, our investments to protect public health and the environment have consistently paid off many times over. We've cut air pollution by 70% and cleaned up half of our nation's polluted waterways, all the while our national economy has tripled. Effective environmental protection is a joint effort of the EPA, states, and our tribal partners. That's why the largest part of our budget, $3.28 billion, or almost 40%, is provided directly to our state and tribal partners. In fiscal year 2017, we're requesting an increase of $77 million in funding for state and tribal assistance categorical grants in support of critical state work in air and water protection, as well as continued support for our tribal partners. This budget request also reinforces EPA's focus on community support by providing targeted funding and support for regional coordinators to help communities find and determine the best programs to address local environmental priorities. The budget includes $90 million in brownfields project grants to local communities. That's an increase of $10 million, which will help to return contaminated sites to productive reuse. This budget prioritizes actions to reduce the impacts of climate change and support the President's Climate Action Plan. It includes $235 million for efforts to cut carbon pollution and other greenhouse gases through common sense standards, guidelines, and voluntary programs. The EPA's Clean Power Plan continues to be a top priority for the EPA and for our nation's inevitable transition to a clean energy economy. Though the Supreme Court has temporarily stayed the Clean Power Plan rule, states are not precluded from voluntarily choosing to continue implementation planning. And EPA will continue to assist states that voluntarily decide to do so. As part of the President's 21st Century Clean Transportation Plan, the budget also proposes to establish a new mandatory fund for the EPA, providing $1.65 billion over the course of 10 years to retrofit, replace, or repower diesel equipment, and up to $300 million in fiscal year 17 to renew our increased funding for the Diesel Emission Reduction Grant Program. The budget also includes $4.2 million increase to enhance vehicle engine and fuel compliance programs, including critical testing capabilities. We also have to confront the systemic challenge that threatens our country's drinking water and the infrastructure that delivers it. This budget includes $2 billion request for the state revolving loan fund and $42 million in additional funds to provide technical assistance to small communities, loan financing to promote public-private collaboration, and training to increase the capacity of communities and states to plan and finance drinking water and wastewater infrastructure improvements. The EPA requests $20 million to fund the Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, or WIFIA program, which will provide direct financing for the construction of water and wastewater infrastructure by making loans for large innovative projects of regional or national significance. This budget also provides $22 million in funding to expand the technical, managerial, and financial capabilities of drinking water systems. Included is $7.1 million for the Water Infrastructure and Resilience Finance Center and the Center for Environmental Finance that will enable communities across the country to focus on financial planning for upcoming public infrastructure investments, expand work with states to identify financing opportunities, in particular for rural communities, and enhance partnership and collaboration with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. EPA is also seeking $20 million increase to the Superfund remedial program, which will accelerate the pace of cleanup, supporting states, local communities, and tribes in their efforts to assess and clean up sites and return them once again to productive reuse. EPA's fiscal year 2017 budget request will let us continue to make a real and visible difference to communities and public health every day and provide us with a foundation to revitalize the economy and improve infrastructure across the country. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Well, thank you, Ms. McCarthy. We appreciate that statement, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes to get started here. Soon after the Supreme Court issued the stay on the Clean Energy Plan, I was reading an article, and it said that in a letter, you said that the rule had been suspended and has no legal force, the rule being the Clean Energy Plan. I was curious, who did you write that letter to? Was that letter sent to all the states, or was this a letter that just was an interagency letter to members that work at EPA, employees?
I don't know which letter you're referring to.
It says, while Administrator McCarthy has suggested that her agency will continue to provide tools and outreach to states, none of these efforts by EPA should be perceived as requiring states to act. The rule has been suspended and has no legal force, the letter stated. So did you send a letter to the states saying that the rule has been suspended and has no legal force?
That would be an accurate statement, sir, and I assume that I did notice people, but I don't know which particular letter. I just don't recall.
So you don't recall sending out a letter? You don't recall sending a letter to the states? I
certainly have said that in person and in letters to a number of individuals explaining that there is a stay in place and EPA won't be implementing or enforcing the law and that it has to work through the courts, but we'd certainly continue to work voluntarily with states that voluntarily want to continue moving.
But you,
with
from,
the plan.
but you don't recollect yourself sending a letter to the states saying that?
I actually believe that I did, sir, but I haven't, you're reading a portion of it doesn't give me complete enough recollection to be able to confirm it positively.
Well, did you send a letter to every?
I did send a letter to states letting them know what happened, yes.
Okay, okay. Now, prior to the Supreme Court stay, each state was expected by September of this year to submit a state implementation plan to EPA. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
And have they been notified that that state implementation plan is no longer expected by September?
I believe everybody is aware of that, yes, sir.
Okay. And now, Ms. McCabe has talked a lot about, and you've also saying you're working with states that want to proceed. How many states would that be?
Well, we're certainly working with many states. Every day that changes. I know that 25 or so states have indicated publicly that they're doing some portion of planning and continuing to think about it. But many states understand that there's a transition in the energy world right now, and that the Clean Power Plan is on hold, but it's going to be looked at on its merits, and they're continuing to think.
But they can do the transition without the Clean Energy Plan, correct?
Well, the energy transition is happening regardless of that, yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about pricing primarily, but two component parts that Ms. McCabe keeps stressing is the Clean Energy Incentive Program and the model rules. And those are integral part of the Clean Energy Plan. Without those, the Clean Energy Plan would not be very effective. Would you agree with that?
No, sir. The Clean Power Plan actually is a rule that is moving forward on its own through the courts. The model rule was something that the states suggested that we do for them, and part of the model rule is how the states might handle the CEIP. So both of those are related, and those are efforts that the states have asked us to do separate. And also related, but on its own separate.
And she refers to those as two key pieces: the Clean Energy Incentive Program and the model rules. Key pieces, but she says it will be done consistent with the court ruling.
Yes.
How do you determine that it is consistent with the court ruling?
Well, the Clean Energy Incentive Plan is part of the Clean Power Plan as it stands that the court is going to be looked at. Separate from that, there's a question of how states might look at the model rule and how that might be also an opportunity to take comment on and look more specifically at how states might look at their Clean Energy Incentive Program. So those are being done for the benefit of the state's understanding, and it's being done at the request of states that voluntarily want to think about how they might comply and think about the planning process.
Might comply with what?
Might think about complying consistent with the Clean Power Plan, but it is not an underlying rule of the plan. It is all voluntary, and it's the states asking us to help them as they're doing their voluntary planning moving forward.
My time has expired. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you again, Administrator McCarthy, for being here today. The fiscal year 2016 omnibus concluded $863 million for the drinking water SRF, which was a $44 million decrease from fiscal year 2015. So I was grateful that the administration has recognized the critical need to invest in our drinking water systems by increasing its request by $158 million for this year. But can you please explain the relationship between the clean and drinking water SRFs?
Yeah, both of those are our SRF programs. One manages our wastewater system, the other our drinking water system. We tend to look at them together, but we also tend to look at what the outstanding needs are in both. Both of them are necessary for clean drinking water, let's make that clear, and rivers and streams that are clean. But when we looked back at what the demand was for each over a period of time, looking out to 2030, we realized that drinking water at this point is in dire need of additional assistance, and we balanced that in terms of how we're looking at both in this budget.
So you acknowledge then that there is this flexibility to shift funds between the two SRFs in order to address their specific needs, is that right?
States have that opportunity to be able to shift as well. There's quite a bit of flexibility in terms of the use of both funds.
Mm-hmm. And it's why I am disappointed to see the $1 billion request for drinking water was at the expense of over a $400 million decrease in clean water. The combined total is some $250 million less than last year's enacted level, and even worse when compared to the last budget request. So can you explain the decision to offset drinking water increase with the clean water? I know you're concerned for obviously having to grow the one account, but overall it appears as though there's a dire need to have very robust funding.
Yeah, I think there needs to be a very serious and larger conversation about this, as I'm sure you would agree overall. Our challenge was to meet the funding levels that were in the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2015. So we didn't have an opportunity to look for significant new funding. And every time that those numbers are increased, it's at the expense of EPA's operating budget. And frankly, with a budget that's only looking for a 2% bump up, it will be very hard for the agency to continue operating at an efficient and successful level if we have to continue to look at significant more investment within our budget for those activities.
Right, which speaks to the role of Congress here as we control the purse strings. It appears as though we have to do a much more, again, robust effort for our water issues. While I understand the budgets are tight, robbing Peter to pay Paul doesn't seem to be the appropriate solution. I'm sure you would agree that both drinking and wastewater systems, as you're indicating, need additional federal support. And so we must ensure that both are adequately funded. As I mentioned earlier, the EPA estimates that there's this 20-year capital needs level of some $384 billion. This estimate has increased in each report since 1995. And I would guess the next estimate will follow that trend. So we have spent 20 years funding the SRF between $800 million and $1 billion. This request appears to be much of the same. I've heard from the mayors in my district, from town supervisors in my district, that cash-strapped local governments simply cannot come up with the financing on their own, and I've had tremendous glaring examples of painful consequences of underfunding. Administrator, the EPA does a lot of work with state and local governments. In your experience, will we make significant progress in closing this $384 billion gap by maintaining the current federal funding levels?
No, it doesn't even come close or consider the fact that we're looking at new emerging contaminants that simply won't be resolved through the technologies we have in hand.
And would you, or do you believe that a more lucrative, a more robust, sustained commitment is needed to reduce the infrastructure project backlog that exists?
I think there needs to be a much larger conversation about how you can start investing in a way that's commensurate with the challenge in the core needs of our communities and families.
Earlier, and I thank you for that, earlier I had mentioned the Aqua Act that I've introduced, and it's driven by the Recovery Act funding levels, and so that defines our first-year commitment in that legislation of $3.1 billion, and then ramping up to $5.5 billion. And again, we would call for tremendously focused attention to the water infrastructure in this country, and I thank you, Administrator McCarthy, for again responding in a way that I think is deeply rooted in commitment to helping our state and local governments. Mr. Chair, I hope this is an issue that we can continue to investigate to ensure communities across this nation are getting support to meet their public health, public safety, and infrastructure needs. All very important. I think some of the flare-ups we've seen across this nation in all geographic regions reminds us that our work is far from done. So with that, I'll yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So again, welcome, Administrator. The good news is we got your letter today in response to statements for the record from Acting Assistant Administrator McCabe, who testified before us in October. The bad news is they create some more questions based upon, and so I want to weave the story, and maybe you can help get this clarified for us. The basis of my questions in the statement of record was to ask about the regulatory impact analysis that was used to promulgate the CO2 regulations. So throughout the transcript, I continue to kind of push McCabe on give us how you calculated how many power plants would be operating, because if you're going to do a regulatory impact analysis and the cost, Basic Economics 101 says supply and demand, because there is a 31 gigawatt difference between the Energy Information Agency and what this regulatory impact analysis says from your agency. So we were hoping that for the record, we would get back what was the formula that the EPA used to calculate the amount of power plants that were going to be decommissioned. What we got was a statement. The EPA discussed the assumptions underlying each of these projections in the regulatory impact analysis accompanying the final Clean Power Plan. So the questions I asked to be clarified using the regulatory impact analysis were responded by a letter that says refer to the regulatory impact analysis. So if you could help us get the real data and a better answer, I would appreciate that.
Mr. Chairman, I will do the very best I can to answer your questions today or to provide you follow-up.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the bottom line is if you've lost 70 power plants, that does have an effect on,
Yes.
and we just want to find out how you all figured that out versus the Energy Information Agency. And so we're glad you got that letter to us punctually. Otherwise, I would have had to send another letter. So thank you. Let me go, since we've talked about TSCA a little bit. As you know, we're hoping to get something to the president. Do you have any idea of, there's three questions. Do you have any idea of what it might cost you to assess 10 chemicals in a given year? This is what we need. So 10 or 20. And then really the third question is, did you consider what would be a budget baseline for operating a reformed TSCA program, and if fees were capped at $18 million per year? So we're trying to get an idea of if there are fees, what are your costs? Are they in the ballpark and stuff? So
Well, that's well within the range of the technical information that both you and Congressman Pallone have been asking for. I'm more than happy to support, to provide you with whatever information I can.
Thank you very much, and I'm glad you mentioned Ranking Member Pallone. He's been very, very helpful on movement of this, and we're hopeful we'll get to some agreement in the future. My last question, because I have a minute and a half left, is I did mention in my opening statement Superfund cleanup, CERCLA. Has the ratio of administrative costs to cleanup costs changed over the last few years? And if so, how? My big concern is always we have the Superfund. A lot of it goes for the administration and litigation cost. What's the ratio between that portion of the fund and actually cleanup cost?
Yeah.
And do you know if there's been any significant change in that? I want money to go to cleanup more than bureaucracy.
I don't know the answer, but we'll certainly follow up.
Okay, thank you. And since I have 45 seconds left, I'll yield back my time and thank the chairman.
Chairman yields back. This time, the chair recognizes the gentleman from the.
You want to go ahead, Frank? I'll take it.
You? Who?
Yeah, I'll take it.
Mr. McNerney of California for 5 minutes.
Thanks for indulging the confusion, Mr. Chairman. Administrator McCarthy, I know the EPA is working to deal with drought issues.
Yes.
Of course, I'm from California. We know about drought. Can you explain some of the ways the EPA is working to address drought through technology and innovation?
Yeah, yes, sir. We are working pretty hard through our national resilience effort. working with other agencies to develop tools that communities can use to identify both what the drought challenge is and a variety of tools in which they can design systems more effectively. Those are everything from stormwater to their drinking water systems, looking at potential impacts, keeping our communities safe, making sure that our water and wastewater facilities are operating correctly. And so we have a variety of tools that we work. We also have people that go to communities. We have regional folks that go to communities and work with them and try to help design solutions that they can manage the kind of adaptive behavior that they need to have in a changing climate.
Do you believe that California can become regionally self-sufficient? In other words, different parts of California can become water self-sufficient, ultimately?
You know, there are smarter people in California than I that know the answer to that question, sir, but I know that we're available to work with anyone in California that wants to roll up their sleeves and look at this issue.
Thank you. I've been a proponent of water use efficiency, and it's important, especially considering threats to our water supply, for us to protect our water sources and to conserve our water supply. One program that aims to help communities conserve water and promote long-term sustainable infrastructure is the WaterSense program. Can you please describe some of the successes of the WaterSense program?
Well, I'm more than happy to supply you with a lot, but WaterSense is beginning to be seen, and it's been used in California as a really good opportunity. Basically, it does the boring work of water conservation. It allows you to take a look at where your water is going, how much it costs, where it's leaking, and how do you take advantage of that. Everything from how you can conserve in a household to how you can look at it from a systems approach from a community or a region. So we have some really dedicated people that are doing great work at all levels on WaterSense.
Well, moving on, the gas leak in California has raised the public awareness of how gas is leaking into the environment. I know it's not exactly related, but do you believe there's sufficient data related to lost and accountable gas so that we understand how much gas is actually leaking to the environment across the country?
Actually, we have been learning recently, most recently through our last greenhouse gas inventory, how little we actually have known about the methane leaks in our oil and gas sector and our pipelines. We're getting educated. It's more than we ever thought before, but there clearly needs to be a continued effort to gather information. We fully intend to do that.
So what do we have to do to get a hold of this and to stop the leakage or to reduce the leakage?
Well, we have announced that we're actually going to put out an information collection request to the industry to get information from the oil and gas sector in particular. And then the challenge will be, what are the cost-effective and available technologies that can reduce those leaks, look at the operating practices that need to be done differently to maintain those. But the good news is about methane, in particular natural gas, is that it's a product that's leaking, not a byproduct. And so the more you can capture it, the more it's a very cost-effective way to run your business.
There's an economic driver, in other words.
Yes, that's right.
Very good. So what is the current state of carbon sequestration?
Carbon sequestration is available. It continues to be something that we're going to be relying on more and more. The Department of Energy has a robust program that's looking at carbon sequestration as well as use and sequestration. It's being utilized in a number of facilities in the U.S. We'd like it to be more used. We'd like the cost to go down considerably as it's being used, so that it becomes more and more available. It's most cost-effective when it's joined with enhanced oil recovery. That's when you have a good system or when it's used to actually produce chemicals.
So can we save the coal industry with carbon sequestration?
I actually think that carbon sequestration is going to be important, not just domestically, but clearly internationally. Coal is going to be around, whether it's in the U.S. or it's in other countries, and it's important for us to have technologies that can allow coal to continue to be part of the energy system.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. We do have a series of 4 votes on the floor, but before we go, I'm going to get Mr. Upton and Mr. Pallone, and then once they complete, we'll try to come back here at 3:30 to give everyone else an opportunity to ask questions. Yes, Mr. Upton, you're recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, Ms. McCarthy, we're glad that you're here today. I want to thank you just real quickly for your support of the bill that we passed. Every member of this committee supported on the House floor, H.R. 4470, which did pass 416 to 2 to try to clear up the confusion and close the gaps when communities like Flint are known. And we're hoping that that gets to the president's desk in some form when it comes back from the Senate. A couple questions. We are going to have a hearing in two of our subcommittees together next month that really look to the future on this issue. Not pointing fingers. It's my understanding that we're working with your Assistant Administrator for Office of Water, Joel Bouvet, to be our EPA person who's going to come testify. A question that I have for you, a couple questions as it relates to the future. I know in the Protecting America Waters book, I'll read you briefly, it says, in FY 2017, the EPA will begin to fund WIFIA projects. EPA expects that entities with large-scale complex water and wastewater projects will be attracted to WIFIA through the EPA will work to provide assistance through a diverse set of projects. How many communities do you think may apply for funds once that program is out there?
We're requesting $20 million,
Right.
15 of which would be used for leveraging opportunities. It's not clear to me how many that would
50
actually-
communities, 30, 20,
It depends upon the size.
any idea? Will there be some accommodation for rural areas that may have, some set aside for rural communities or under 100,000 population?
You know, we haven't yet determined that, sir. I'm sorry.
Okay.
But I'm happy to take your comments or concerns about that if you'd like me to.
Yeah. I know that you're working on a new copper and lead rule. What is your expectation as to when that will be ready to be put
Well,
out
we'd
for
like it to
comment?
be done as soon as possible, but I think the tragedy in Flint has made it very clear to us that we have to tackle this in a substantive way. So our goal is to get a rule both proposed and finalized next fiscal year.
And how many, as you look at the entire country, how many communities, I know Flint is in terrible distress over what happened, and I would hope that there are no other communities in that same position. But how many communities do you think, or how many states have communities like that are in need of resources that could replace some of their lead lines to their residents? How widespread of a problem is that? We've seen stories in different publications. USA Today has had some good ones in the last number of days in terms of communities. What would your estimate be?
Let me give you a sense of this, and I want to make sure I answer your question. There are about 68,000 public water systems that have to report to us under the lead and copper rule. And about 96% of those have had no exceedances of the action level over the past 3 years. So what I'm trying to do is, I think Flint is unique, but I think there are challenges in communities. And one of the things that I did was to write to every governor and to write to every, what we call the primacy agency, the agency that's responsible for that at the state level, to ask them to do a few things, to get back to us to make sure that they're following and implementing the current statute, to ask them to identify where their lead lines are publicly and put it on the web, to start publishing their results.
And that's a little bit of a requirement that we had in our bill, right? H.R. 4470, if you found a problem, right? You would do that.
That is exactly right. That's exactly the same thing. Because one of the things we realize is with Flint happening, you're right, it's a failure of government.
Knowing that my time is expiring, and I want to let Mr. Pallone have the balance before these votes, do you think that it's possible that when we convene again next month, when we have this hearing on looking to the future, do you think you'll have some of that information available that you can provide to us prior to the hearing?
We will. We know there's about 10 million lead lines, but the challenge is to treat water so that it's not corrosive, to systemically get rid of the lead lines, and then to address the lead that's actually in people's plumbing fixtures, so that it's a multifaceted challenge, and it's one we have to tackle.
Thank you. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. This time, Chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. We've got to be quick because we're going to go vote. So and I have to cover both Superfund and beaches in one
Yes.
fell swoop here. So on the Superfunds, cleaning up toxic Superfund sites not only reduces health risks, it helps create jobs during the cleanup and through newly uncontaminated and productive land ready for redevelopment, as you know. Unfortunately, Congress has failed to reinstate the Superfund tax, leading to fewer resources for the program. In fact, the resources have essentially been cut in half over the last 2 decades. Without those revenues, important Superfund cleanups have been delayed. The backlog of sites has grown and the costs have shifted to the taxpayers. So let me ask you first, would you say that the success of the Superfund program depends directly on the funding it receives?
Yes.
And would more funding then mean more cleanups?
Absolutely. We're requesting an additional 20 million, which should get us 3 to 5 more started, but we certainly have a significant backlog.
I appreciate that. I think it's clear that the Superfund and Brownfields programs show that creating jobs and cleaning up the environment are not mutually exclusive. Now let me get to my beaches questions. Representing a coastal district has always been one of my top priorities to ensure the water at our nation's beaches is not contaminated and dangerous for those who visit them to swim, surf, and fish. And that's why, as you know, I was disappointed to see that the Beach Act grant program hasn't zeroed out again in the president's budget. States utilize these funds to monitor water quality and notify the public when our coastal waters are not safe for swimming. So my question is, do you believe EPA's beach grants have been successful over the years in expanding the number of beaches tested nationwide and keeping swimmers out of contaminated waters?
Yeah, I believe that it has been a good program. I think where we have challenges is that it was supposed to start up to make sure that communities and states have the ability to monitor and do this effectively. We believe that that ability is now there, which is why we think it is, in a tight budget, it's one of the areas in which we can be a little bit tighter in terms of.
Well, you know, I disagree because I think that a lot of these towns don't have the resources. So I'm going to try to work with you and my colleagues, as we did last year, to restore this funding that helps address these health risks. The other issue related is another successful method, is spotting spilled oil in commercial areas like the New York, New Jersey harbor and collecting it before it damages the environment was the helicopter. You know that in 2014, EPA canceled the helicopter monitoring program in EPA Region 2, but operating in the summer to monitor the waters in the harbor, identify debris, oil slicks, and algal blooms. Since the helicopter monitoring program was canceled, how is EPA engaging in the Floatables Action Plan in the New York and New Jersey region?
Well, we're certainly monitoring the activities that both of the states have to have boots on the ground there to make sure they see the oil as it occurs and is able to address it. And we have a task force that I think we pulled together to make sure that we understand what the implications of having disinvested in that helicopter might be, if any. So we want to continue to work with you, sir, on this issue because I know it's important to you.
You know, when we spoke about this last year, you said that there would be basically a web of protection in place to guarantee no gaps in coverage with respect to monitoring the New Jersey coast. Has the EPA taken some specific actions to fill the gaps left by the cancellation of the helicopter?
Well, I think we felt that the helicopter at this point, because of the actions that the states have taken, was not as necessary as it was before. We didn't feel like we would be putting the water at risk by not continuing to fund it. And so we do feel that there is a robust system in place.
See, the problem that I have with both the Beaches Act and the helicopter is that, using New Jersey as an example, but I'm sure New York is the same, is, the state and the towns and the counties all complain that they have less money and that they can't fill the gap. And so that's why if there was any way, obviously, to get the beaches grants back in place or to get the helicopter back in place and to pay for it federally, it would make a big difference because I know you believe that the states and the localities can make up the difference, but I really don't think that's the case. So.
I appreciate that, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back, and Ms. McCarthy, once again, I apologize for this interlude, but I want you to know we have one of the best Subway sandwich stores in the basement. We'll be back at 3:30, hopefully.
Thank you so much.
So we'll recess until 3:30. We'll reconvene the meeting and the hearing. Thank you for your patience, Ms. McCarthy. At this time, I'd like to recognize for 5 minutes the gentleman from Texas, the Vice Chairman of the Energy and Power Subcommittee, Mr. Olson.
I thank the chair and welcome Ms. McCarthy. We've had our disagreements. Some are pretty strong, but there is some things we agree upon, like the Houston Astros going to Yankee Stadium and kicking the tar out of the New York Yankees 3-0 last September.
Totally agree on that one.
There we go. And I appreciate the positive steps you've taken on exceptional events in that new rule. Thank you for that. That being said, though, I've heard recently that EPA has a proposal to change the rules on how locals work with y'all on transportation issues, projects, highway projects. I'm told that the changes to transportation air modeling could add months of delay and hundreds of thousands of dollars to highway projects. States are saying that this new quote-unquote air mod model is more complex and less accurate than current models. Apparently, the Federal Highway Association's concerns may have fallen on deaf ears with EPA. So my question is, did EPA know of FHA's concerns? If so, were they ignored, and why were they ignored, if so as well?
Sorry, I'm afraid that I'm going to have to get back to you on that. I'm not familiar with any recent changes to the air model, but certainly our goal in any model change is to get more accurate as well as more simple in terms of how you can ensure compliance and work can continue. So
I like
let me
accurate and
go
simple. That sounds good. Yes,
Simple
ma'am.
works
Let's work
really
together.
well.
Make this staff work with me. Make this, get some information. Make sure there's no problem
That'd
here.
be great.
Great, thank you. Question number 2 is, last week I introduced a bipartisan new bill on the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, H.R. 4775. It has almost a dozen provisions that would make the implementation of the ozone standards and other NAAQS practical and cost effective. I don't know if you had a chance to look at that bill yet. Have you seen that yet, ma'am, or probably too quick?
I have not studied it, sir, no.
Can I get you to promise to work with me to get that bill, at least discuss what we can come to, work together to get some common sense, that's the right term for it, but something that guys can achieve out there, because I'm concerned about, right now, many counties are not attained with the current standards. And going lower, let them get full attainment, then let them go lower. So let's work on that together. Can we do that, please?
Well, sir, I'll be happy to continue to talk to you on it. I do know if this is on is this ozone that we're talking about?
It's ozone, yes,
next?
ma'am, mostly, yep.
Yeah, okay.
And question number 3, as states struggle to implement EPA's ambient air quality standards, they send SIPs, State Implementation Plans, to you, EPA. You approve these plans so the states can go about their business of having cleaner air. Your budget documents indicate that at the end of 2015, FY 2015, EPA had 557 backlog SIPs.
Mm-hmm.
And while the Clean Power Plan is in limbo now because of the courts, the Supreme Court, can you shift that money to get rid of this backlog of these SIPs? Can you take it from the Clean Power Plan and make it address these backlogs of SIPs? Is it money you need, or what do you need to get this backlog fixed?
Actually, the challenge for us, and we do have a plan that we've worked on with the states that is ratcheting down the backlogs in the system. You mentioned the exceptional events.
Yep.
What we found was our failure to address exceptional events well and to make that a streamlined opportunity for states to talk about when they have an anomaly that they want credit for. We found that in California, the minute we did an exceptional event policy for high wind events, they could release 200 state implementation plans. So it is more than money. It's really looking at what the substantive issues is and making sure we're doing our job to speak to the policy itself so that the regions are comfortable in going through the approval process and getting that done.
And one final invitation, olive branch per se. Mr. McAdoo from California talked about carbon capture sequestration.
Yes.
You mentioned EPA has some projects that are viable for enhanced oil recovery. That's right there in my district. It's called the Parish Power Plant, the Petronova Project.
Yeah.
Come on down and see it. They've got 4 coal generators and 4 natural gas. They're capturing coal out of 1 generator, putting that in a pipeline. There's an oil field about 65 miles to the south. Get that in there. Pressure, more oil, pays for itself. Come on and see it personally.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate the invitation.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. This time, Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator McCarthy, thank you for being here today, and it's always a pleasure to have you before the committee. And I thank you for coming to Houston last month for the CERNA week, and I'm glad they treated you well there at that energy conference. One of my questions, and we talked about it when you were in Houston, families in our district in eastern Harris County are very concerned about the dioxin and pollutants found in the San Jacinto River waste pits. The waste pits were declared a Superfund site 8 years ago, and to date, no final decision has been made. Administrator McCarthy, when will EPA make a final decision on remediating the San Jacinto River waste pits?
Sir, I'll have to get back to you when a final decision is. I know that the concern is to make sure that we address the interim measures that we need to keep the opportunity to have that safe and go through the process to define the final remedy.
Okay. Local stakeholders in our district are concerned that EPA will decide to keep the dioxin in the river underneath a temporary armored cap that it was put in place a few years ago. Our communities fear that the armored cap would fail as it did recently, either during a major flood, hurricane, or the damage by barge, which happened recently. CERCLA requires and prefers remedies that are permanently and significantly reduce the volume, toxicity, and movement of the hazardous substances for the protection of human health and environment. And I've joined the local stakeholders in calling that full removal. The concern I have, Administrator McCarthy, is by leaving dioxin in the floodplain in an aquatic environment is not an appropriate permanent solution. And what would prevent the EPA from adopting the most preventative remedy possible for the Superfund site, like, building a container wall and then removing that dioxin facility?
Well, generally, what we do, sir, is when we put out for comment a proposed remedy, when you look at a proposed plan, we'll put a range of options out, and we look at that from how protective they are, how certain we are that they're going to remain protective, as well as look at the costs associated with that. So I'm sure you'll see that we'll put out a full range of options for folks to comment on, and I appreciate the fact that you've communicated with me strongly about the interests of your constituents here.
Well, and I appreciate EPA having a hearing in Channelview, Texas 6 weeks ago or so, and I was glad to be there. And I also noticed, is it true that EPA requested $1.13 billion for Superfund for the next fiscal year, the lowest request in 14 years? Is it $1.13 billion, the budget request?
I am not aware that of how low it is compared to other years. I know that it's an increase over what we had requested last year of $20 million.
And is it true that EPA completed work on only 8 Superfund sites in fiscal year 2014, the lowest number of construction completions since 1997?
I can get back to you on that as well, sir.
Given the low number of sites, which includes the San Jacinto River, I would hope our budget proposal would be much higher than what the EPA requested. Last month in your visit to Houston, we discussed our air quality and monitoring. We have our challenge in Houston. I want to work with you to improve our situation as rapidly as possible. Can you give me a quick overview of the EPA's budget on air monitoring and improvement?
Yes, sir. We have a robust monitoring network, but we are requesting an additional $40 million for monitoring technology for the states. And as you know, we've requested an increase in state and tribal categorical grants of about $77 million. So we do think we have good monitors out there. We need more ability to be able to support state efforts. one of the things that I think is important to remember is that in your area, I think that your community is working very hard. The communities in that area are. There's significant challenges in port areas.
Yeah.
And that really is something that our DARA program has supported. You know, we're looking for $10 million again this year, but the President has also proposed a climate infrastructure fund that could really ramp up our ability to be able to support reductions in pollution in the port areas that could have appreciable difference in the quality of air in Houston.
Well, thank you. And having the Port of Houston an industrial port, and it is important, particularly with our industries on the side.
They do a good job. I've actually been there to give them some awards before. They're doing a great job.
Well, we're trying. In fact, I know we have one refinery who has problems, and I suggested to the EPA that refinery ought to be able to monitor their own fence line, because again, in our area, we have literally fence line to fence line of industry, and we want to know who the bad actors are, the ones who need help, and that fence line monitoring by the industry would be helpful.
And the technology is there, and in fact, our most recent changes to the refinery rule are going to start requiring that. So we're interested in the same thing, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your patience. I'd like to submit a question on methane emissions to the administrator, and appreciate you responding.
Without objection. This time, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Administrator. Thanks very much for being with us today. Last October, the EPA revised its 2008 ozone standards. Is that correct?
Yes, yes, sir.
How many counties does EPA expect will be designated to be in non-attainment with the 2015 standards?
Actually, the best of my recollection, and I can get back to you on that, is it's going to amount to, we estimated about a dozen areas potentially, in addition to some areas in the state of California, which face particularly unusual challenges because of the geology.
But do you know how many counties, just not the states?
That would be, that's how many areas
Because
that we're looking at.
looking with the Congressional Research Service has said, based on their most recent data, we're looking at probably 241 counties in 33 states. Does that sound correct?
I think that may be an overestimate on the basis of what we believe our current on-the-books rules will do in terms of reducing NOx and VOC emissions. We have taken a lot of steps, as you know, to reduce air pollution, and we think they'll have an appreciable difference in terms of the years. We're not looking at what's out of attainment now, because attainment isn't until 2017. So we're looking at data from 2014, 15, and 16 to make a judgment on what's out of, what is in non-attainment. And we don't think that's going to amount to a significant amount of designated areas.
Okay, but just out of curiosity then, why did CRS come up with 241? Wouldn't they be looking at the data?
I'm happy to go back and take a look at that, and also to verify the number of areas we're talking about. I apologize,
Okay.
but
Yeah, if you could do that, I'd appreciate if you get back to the committee on that.
I'm happy to do that.
Okay, and then also, going right along with that, because again, my district, I have 60,000 manufacturing jobs in Northwest, West Central Ohio. And has the EPA done any analysis of the impacts of either the 2008 or the 2015 standards on manufacturing in areas designated as being in non-attainment?
We certainly have done an impact assessment. Our understanding of this is that we are focused more on what the impacts are and what it means for individual states and counties. I don't recall a specific impact on industries in those areas. I know there'll be challenges, but I don't think we've understood them to be appreciable.
Okay, let me ask this. Could you define, when you say you've done impact assessment, how would you define that impact assessment, especially if you say you haven't really been looking on the manufacturing side, but again, which is massive for us in Ohio, and also when we look at what happened in the last several years, we were at least about 74, 75% coal-fired power plants in Ohio, and it's down under 70% now. But how would you then define the term impact assessment?
I'm sorry, can we clarify again, sir? Which
Right. You
rule
were
are we
talking
talking
that
about?
you said that you had been working on some impact assessments.
Which rule are we talking about, sir?
Pardon me?
Which rule?
Okay, this would be the 2008 and also the 2015 when you look at the on the non-attainment.
Okay, right.
Right.
Well, you know, we've done some analysis, sir, to look at whether or not the impact of designation on industries and whether or not they can continue. And I think you know that it does put a burden when you're in non-attainment in order to not make the unhealthy air more unhealthy as industries grow. So there are opportunities to look at offsets that can continue to expand industries, and we just have not identified that those are insurmountable in any area. They're more challenging in California than anywhere else, but usually when you're looking in other states, you find opportunities for offsets at reasonable cost that can allow even new industries to locate in non-attainment areas.
Okay, just to follow up on that again, because I'm not sure I caught what you just said a little bit earlier. You said whether they can continue. Are you talking about the manufacturing or the power, or both?
I was talking about manufacturing. At the levels they're manufacturing, and even with new facilities coming in, you need to account for the emissions that you may add into the area, but you can do that using offsets, which means you can look at your permitting process and identify the least expensive way to get NOx reductions and utilize that for new facilities coming in, which is what I understood to be the major issue.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, if I could ask also if maybe we could follow up on that question and then also the earlier question to the administrator to get back with the committee.
Absolutely, without objection. So ordered. This time, the chair would recognize the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Lobsback, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good to see you, Madam Administrator.
You too.
As always, appreciate the work you're doing. A couple questions. As you know, first one, as you know, the Department of Energy states that using ethanol as a vehicle fuel has measurable CHG emissions benefits compared with using gasoline. Carbon dioxide released when ethanol is used in vehicles is in fact offset by the CO2 captured when crops used to make ethanol are grown. Now, given the role of renewable fuels, given the role that renewable fuels play in cutting down greenhouse gases, shouldn't the recent RFS renewable volume obligations, RVOs, be increased to achieve this goal?
We certainly are looking to be as aggressive as we can, knowing that the U.S. is a leader in biofuels. Right. In looking at the aggressive nature of the renewable fuel standard, we are looking for every opportunity to both make it aggressive but also recognize that it has to be achievable at the same time.
Right, because we're going to be working on, you're working on 2017, I assume, is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you'll be hearing from a lot of us, no doubt,
Yes.
as you did in the past, when it came to the past renewable fuel standard. And I know it's controversial. Not everybody, you know, is on board with it on either side of the aisle, for that matter, as well. But
sir, you've spoken to me from Congress. I'm implementing the law as it is, and that's what I do.
Yeah, and I look forward to continuing to have that conversation. In fact, I have some corn growers here in the audience. I just happened to meet with them prior to this meeting. And so that's something that's, you know, clearly important to them and to the whole state of Iowa, for that matter, but not just Iowa, many other places around this country as well. The second one has to do with WOTUS.
Yes.
I'm sure all my colleagues are in agreement that providing clean water is critical for all of us. Folks in the agriculture community recognize as well that we've got to have clean water. One program in particular, of course, the Waters of the U.S. has had a bit of an uphill battle over the years, as we've seen. It's in the courts as we speak. But I think everybody can agree that we have to have clarity on the rules before anything else. That's the one thing I hear from folks in the agricultural community in Iowa more than anything else. You know, I've been taken out to ditches, and folks there are frightened, to be quite honest, that without necessary clarity, that all kinds of lawsuits and all kinds of actions could be taken against them. And I have to say, I understand their concerns. I want to have clean water. I want to make sure we do the right thing. But so do those folks in the rural areas. But we've got to have the clarity when it comes to things like not just streams and rivers, but ditches and ponds and what have you. And there's real concern in farm country that there still isn't that kind of clarity with respect to WOTUS. Can you speak to that?
Well, I think that we tried to actually provide greater clarity. That's what the Clean Water Rule was intended to do. And I actually think we accomplished that in many ways, and we need to have a really good conversation about that, knowing that it's in the courts at this point. But let me give you an example on ditches. Believe me, I never created the word ditch. It's in the statute, which is why we had to deal with it. But we made it really clear that ditches exclude intermittent and ephemeral ditches. It's only when a ditch has been constructed in an existing stream or a wetland that it becomes significant enough to warrant protection.
Can you tell me what intermittent means? Sorry to interrupt. What does intermittent
Basically, you're talking seasonal or just when it rains. I mean, that's what we're talking about. So we have tried to make it clear that these intermittent, these only have water in them every once in a while, do not constitute a jurisdictional water.
Well, you know, I've heard the stories like, what if there's 7 inches of rain
Yep.
and it's not intermittent? But that creates an environmental problem as such, and a DNR person comes out and checks it out, and all of a sudden the farmer's in trouble because it happened to rain 7 inches that night.
Well, that's why what we did here was make it much clearer than the existing rule actually does. We made it clear that that does not constitute a jurisdictional water, only if it was a stream to begin with and you've channeled it. So we tried to get clearer. We've also gotten clearer on erosional features to make the case that if it rains hard, it looks like there's streams everywhere. Those don't count. It only has to be something that is constructed or natural that really can impact the downstream water.
Well, my
Other
time's
than that,
almost
it has
up.
no connection.
And I do appreciate this conversation. I hope we continue to have this conversation. I know you came to the Iowa State Fair a few years
did.
ago. I'll personally invite you out there if you're willing to
Well, thank
come.
you. That's-
And I can guarantee you we can get some folks in the agricultural community together and have
I'll
a
take
conversation.
every opportunity I can. Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much.
And thank you, Mr. Chair, for letting me go over. Thank you. I yield
The
back.
gentleman yields back. This time, the chair recognizes the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again, Ms. McCarthy, for coming. I'm curious that you've given us a kind of a smorgasbord of things to go after here a little bit this morning. If I could just touch base on one, I want to get it clarified. You said that there were more than one facility using carbon capture. You didn't mean coal-fired power plants, did you? Because there's only one coal-fired power plant in America using carbon capture. Is that not correct? In America?
I'd have to go back and check, sir. I haven't looked recently.
That's what you said to me 2 years ago and last year. So I hope you do get back to us on that. But Kemper is the only one. You know that. It's only the only one.
I know Kemper, yes.
So my other question, have you ever visited the West Virginia coal fields or been in a West Virginia coal power plant?
Not that I'm aware of, sir.
Have you ever been to one in Kentucky or Wyoming?
No, sir.
That's what I was afraid of. So I'm just curious, as you know, you're part of this bureaucracy that's passing all these legislative fiats and regulations, but never really touching base with the people that you're affecting their lives. Muniz, when he was here the other day, the secretary said he wants to come to West Virginia and he wants to see, because he had heard about the Longview power plant. Do you know anything about the Longview power plant?
No, sir, I don't.
That's one of the most efficient, if not the most efficient power plant in America, and it doesn't use carbon capture. So I will extend the invitation to you again and again. I've done that, and whatever your schedule has never permitted you to come to West Virginia. So I think we better take this seriously, the impact we're having on people's lives. You know, in the last couple of weeks, some of the candidates have been saying that we need to move away from coal and other fossil fuels in their campaigns. And one of them said, we're going to put a lot of coal miners out of work. Do you agree with that? Is that good for the economy to put our coal miners out of work?
Well, it's certainly not good for anybody to be out of work in an economy.
So you would disagree? You would disagree with that premise that someone said we ought to put them out of work?
Well, personally, I do not agree that anyone in the United States of America should go without a job who wants to.
Thank you. Okay. So if I could go back to your other part of your testimony also, you talked about a stable climate. And you want to maintain a stable climate. But unfortunately, the rest of the world doesn't seem to be following in that footsteps, in that stable climate. We've got a chart someplace they're going to put up here in a minute that shows the taking, my clock is ticking.
Technology is always tricky.
Yeah, it's always. Well, thank you. Unfortunately, Mr. Chairman, I was told that that chart would be up. It shows that China is going to increase its production or use of coal by 460 gigawatts of power, and India another 360 gigawatts of power. I don't know what's going to take. The world's not following our leadership, so I'm curious that if we, as 2 or 3 years ago, I raised the same question to you, you're going to get back to me, and I never heard back from you again, and that was that according to the IPCC with the United Nations said that if we terminated all coal-fired power plants in America, so we didn't burn 1 ton of coal in America, the total reduction to CO2 in the globe would only be 0.2%. Do you think that's a measurable impact on the climate of the world? If, especially given that the other nations aren't going to follow? So if we terminate 0.2, but yet the other nations of China and India are going to way more than make up for that loss, it's worth it to our economy to put all our people and our coal companies out of work for something that's not measurable?
Sir, I am not looking at making any choices on the kinds of energy that are generated. I'm really trying to keep my eye on my job, which is to try to reduce pollution in ways that are reasonable.
But you are taking out someplace along the line. It was not yours, but others. The Interior just put 33 our coal reserves in the Western coal on federal land. They put it on the shelf and said we don't have access to it to generate power. 40% of America's power comes from coal, from federal lands, and 33% of our reserve comes from federal land, and they just put 33% on the shelf. We can't access it. So it may not be your department, but it's your part of that administration that has this war on coal that is saying we're not going to use coal. And even your successors are talking the same language. I don't understand. If it doesn't have an impact on climate change around the world, why are we subjecting our hardworking taxpayers and men and women in the coal fields to something that has no benefit?
Well, I think, sir, we see it as having had enormous benefit in showing sort of domestic leadership as well as garnering support around the country for the agreement we reached in Paris.
But even though no one's following us, China has doubled. Since that Paris Accord, China has already announced that they're going to put up 360. India has announced that they're going to double their use of coal since the Paris Accord. I'm afraid my time's over, but...
Gentleman's time has expired, and we'll ask the staff to get that chart, and we'll include it in the record. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Schrader, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, and I appreciate the Secretary for being here. Always a good time, very interesting comments so far. Learn a lot at these types of hearings about my friends and colleagues around the country. We have a big issue out in Oregon, and I think we saw it nationally with our forests burning up during this last summer, unprecedented wildfires, unprecedented carbon pollution into the atmosphere. Exactly the opposite, I think, what we're trying to do with all these programs at EPA.
Yes.
And in that regard, we're trying to use and work our forests in a much more sustainable manner. There's an opportunity for more active timber management, I think, that would take that carbon fuel, if you will, out of the forest and make it healthier. And the devil's always in the details, needless to say. One thing I'd ask you to look at in your department and in trying to encourage use of a carbon-neutral life cycle resource like wood and like our forests is look at some of the standards that you have. In September, the agency put out some standards regarding government procurement,
yes.
Dealing with different, third-party verification processes, and very concerned that it inadvertently, I hope, discriminates against a large part of our land mass, particularly in the West, where there's alternate ways to look at certification of these forests for sustainable practices. There's FSC, and out where we are, it's a lot of SFI I won't bore the committee with all the acronym evaluations here, but you understand where I'm going with that. And I'd urge you to take a look at that. My evaluation on your website is that they all meet the criteria you've put out there. I've gone through an appendix from your agency that talks about the different pieces or evaluations that each goes through. It looks almost exactly the same when it comes to species, monitoring, control and response to disease and disturbances, these sorts of things, reforestation. There's a difference maybe in the acreage size. That's the only thing I can see there. And frankly, rural Oregon is not doing well. Rural America isn't doing well. They have not recovered from the Great Recession. My city of Portland's doing great, but I'm interested in how the rest of the country's doing. And what's happened because of these artificial standards, I think, are misapplied and could stand some revision. These forests could be put back to sustainable use, decrease our carbon footprint, and hopefully employ lots of people in this country, folks in my state. We'll give you a quick example. In Oregon, there's over 4.3 million acres that are certified by the three big programs that are out there. EPA's current recommendation, current interim rule, would exclude over 4.1 million of those 4.3 million acres. That just doesn't seem right, Madam Secretary. And we all want to be in the same place, I think, on this. And I think you get broader support for some of the rules and some of the work you're trying to do at EPA if you open up a little bit to some of these other certification programs that are just as valid, very well certified by third-party people. That if you could do that, I'd really appreciate it. Maybe get back to myself and maybe members of the committee on how you're going to be looking at that.
Well, sir, I really appreciate your comments. We did hear that we were too narrow in the interim. We went with the standard that the Department of Energy was using, which is why it seemed like a reasonable first step.
Sure.
But in no way was it the only step that we're taking. So we're taking a look already at all the other standard-setting opportunities that we have to see if they're comparable, equally aggressive, how we would take account of those. And we recognize that there's work to be done, and we're starting that work now.
All right. Well, very good, because there's a lot of lives, jobs, and community sustainability at stake here, as well as our forests.
Thank you.
Thank you. With that, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. This time, Chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Mr. McKinley was talking earlier and raised concerns about the fact that coal in the U.S., federal lands are off limits. Many, many jobs have been lost. You acknowledge that it's always bad for folks to be unemployed. A large number of the people in Mr. McKinley's district and in my district are now unemployed as a result of policies of this administration, including your agency itself. And you indicated, and correct me if I got it wrong, you indicated that you were just, doing your job, trying to set examples. But I would submit that because of the concerns that Mr. McKinley raised with China increasing even after the Paris Accord was reached by the President, and India, according to Mr. McKinley, is going to be doubling their use of coal. And, of course, they want to be energy independent, as many nations want to, and they have some coal. I'm just concerned that we're actually doing more harm to the world's environment, particularly in relationship to the air, because when we take our previously reasonable regulations and we ratchet it up and we throw folks out of work, we raise the cost of energy in our country, and we put our manufacturers at a disadvantage, and then they decide that it's easier in some cases, and some not, but in some cases they decide it's easier to go places where they don't have those regulations, whether it be Mexico or China or India or some other nation, but where they don't have the regulations that we have, they were actually creating a net increase in air pollution. And I'm just wondering, have y'all not looked at that? Now, I understand your job is just the United States, but when you're putting my folks out of work and Mr. McKinley's folks out of work, and I think there's a good likelihood that there's a net increase, I'm just wondering, have you all looked at the possibility that you may be inadvertently creating, and we can disagree about what is and isn't a pollutant, but are you inadvertently creating a net increase in the Northern Hemisphere for the air that we all breathe, whether it's in China or India or in Salem, Virginia?
Well, if you're looking at greenhouse gases, sir, it doesn't matter where it's emitted. I think it matters to all of us. I will say that we've been working with a lot of businesses, a lot of international businesses that are actually expressing serious concern that we do take notice of climate change and take action on it. But I'll also say that the administration, I think, is very cognizant that that the coal communities, the communities that rely on coal, are facing significant challenges. And we're interested in really moving forward with the President's Power Plus proposal to see how we can build an economy that will be more sustainable and
And look, I don't disagree with that. That's an area where, you know, I think we've got to put some resources there to try to help these communities. But that being said, what do you do in a community where we had a dispute over a piece of land? Because in Dickinson County, in my district, there were 2 pieces of flat land in the entire county that could be built on, and they needed a new high school, so they had to use eminent domain to take one of the 2 pieces. How are we going to reinvent the economy? They have mountains, they have water, and they have trees.
Yeah.
We don't have flat land. And in Buchanan County, the largest chunk of our flat land is formerly a surface mine that leveled things out, but folks think that's bad. So it really puts us in a dilemma. And then I have another dilemma that I think I have to bring up, and that is many of my constituents don't understand an EPA that has, you know, 8 buildings in the Washington, D.C. area, has got 12 different zip codes, got so many employees floating around up here, and they say to me, why don't you defund the EPA completely? And I have always defended by saying, well, let's look at our clean water programs. There are other things that the EPA does that I think are good. And then we have the Flint, Michigan problem. Yes. And I don't know how I'm going to tell those folks now, well, we've got these programs like clean water, when clearly, and I know that there was some dispute in another committee earlier this week, but clearly the EPA dropped the ball. It looks like to me, I was in on one of those hearings in O&I or in Government Reform Committee, and it looked clear to me like one of your employees was doing a cover-up, told Ms. Walters of Flint, Michigan, that they had handled Del Toro, the employee of the EPA who it appears was punished for blowing the whistle on the lead out there. I think that's a problem. And then a former employee now, Ms. Hedman, you know, comes in and says that she didn't think she did anything wrong. My constituent, Mark Edwards, a Virginia Tech professor, and look, I don't know his politics, but Blacksburg is not a conservative area. It's one of the most liberal areas of Virginia and one of the most liberal areas in my district. But he says, I guess you don't have, if you're part of a government agency, it means you don't have to say you're sorry, and said that she was willfully blind, unremorseful, and completely unrepentant and unable to learn from her mistakes. How do I defend an EPA that's the condemnation coming out of my district from Professor Dr. Edwards? That's the thing I've always pointed to as being one of the good things. My time is up. I don't know if the chairman will let you answer that or not. I apologize, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Did you want to respond or not?
I'm sure it's not an easy answer, sir. But you know, I've asked the Office of our Inspector General to take a look at this. I think the distinction I was trying to make is Flint is no doubt a tragedy. You know, I know how it came about. Why, I don't know, but I know how it came about. And the question for EPA is, did we respond quickly enough when we found out that there was a problem? Did everybody raise it as quickly as they could so that we could address it? That's a significant issue of accountability that we need to face. And we will face that. The individual in the region did resign knowing it was on her watch, but we'll see what the Office of the Inspector General says. But I think people...
I don't think it's just the Inspector General, Madam. I believe it's also you. You're the boss.
Yes, yes.
Gentleman's time has expired. At this time, the chair will recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Capps, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ranking members. Thank you for holding this hearing. Thank you, Administrator McCarthy, for being here today. Clean drinking water, wastewater treatment, stormwater management systems, these are critical to our nation's basic functioning. Accessible water for agriculture is paramount to our economy and our food security. But unfortunately, and as has been discussed, our nation's water infrastructure is aging and deteriorating, and the impacts of this deterioration are significant and they are costly. We also know that climate change is directly threatening our ability to guarantee the delivery of safe and reliable drinking water, and at the same time, it exacerbates the inadequacies of our nation's water infrastructure. So it's kind of a perfect storm. One effect of climate change that has been particularly devastating to my home state of California is drought, a word we hadn't talked about for a little while. but it's always there. While parts of California have had a little rain recently as a result of some kind of ongoing El Nino, this relief has not been equally felt across the state, and we are by no means out of the woods. For example, in my district is a lake called Lake Achuma. It's the source of our drinking water for over 220,000 residents in and around Santa Barbara. This vitally important reservoir has less than 15% of the water it can hold, and given the impacts of climate change, drought will unfortunately continue to be a pervasive issue, not only in California, but other states as well. We have to act now to minimize the impacts of the changes and ensure that we're prepared. We have to do everything at once, juggle a lot of balls for the challenges that are ahead. I know EPA is working to address these issues, and just yesterday the President announced the establishment of the National Drought Resilience Partnership, NDRP. They always get an acronym right away, as part of his climate action plan. NDRP will help to coordinate drought-related efforts, which is good. Communities mitigating the effects of the drought and build resilience. Those are the key words, mitigation and resilience against future droughts. Everything has to be done at the same time. The NDRP will help coordinated do all this, and I applaud the President for these efforts, as it clearly needs to be a priority for us all. I have a few questions for you, if we can kind of zip through them. I wanted you to just briefly describe EPA's role in the NDRP.
Well, EPA is part of the partnership.
Yes.
EPA brings to it a level of expertise in how communities can work through these issues. We provide tools.
So
that
you're
communities
at the table.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Okay. So are there some existing programs that you have already that will help to implement this initiative?
Yes, we have been leading really a federal effort to look at resiliency issues and to develop tools that communities can use to understand opportunities for capturing water, keeping it local, and preserving it and conserving it.
And can I go home and talk about how the EPA's drought-related efforts will assist communities like ours right on the Central Coast, because they're waiting for some good news?
Yes.
Okay, they look to the sky and the rain doesn't come enough, and now they're going to look to you, Administrator McCarthy. As part of the NDRP, what kind of outreach and education strategies will be utilized? A lot of this is in how we present ourselves in the community. Are we here to work with existing partnerships? And there are many of them on the ground.
Well, we certainly, as part of our proposal, are looking for some more and additional money to look at making sure we have basically what we call circuit riders, which is individuals with expertise in this area so that they can be available full-time to go work with communities on this issue.
Can you describe that? There's another minute left on my time. We raced fast.
Yes.
I'd like to hear more about these circuit riders. That's kind of a Western
well,
term.
circuit riders mean that you can't build expertise everywhere and afford to get everybody up to a certain level. So you basically have people in each region whose job it will be to work with communities, identify opportunities for tools that are available to us. We actually have a whole local community package on our webpage of tools that they can look at and make available to themselves, and hopefully it will help them jumpstart. Then we share best practices. We look at what community was like yours that we could marry with and make progress moving forward.
Thank you. I'm going to suggest what you're saying. Hopefully there's a way I can do that with some of my district folks. What has happened now with this word drought that's looming large for us is that this suddenly has everybody's attention. And, we've got all these constituencies all needing water. And so reclaiming, recycling, we're building a desal plant. We have to look to you as a partner at the table.
And one of the issues we need to look at is how that's connected with infrastructure investments like drinking water, storm water. You need to keep water local. Drinking water systems like the one in Flint loses 30 to 40% of its water in leaks alone. We simply can't afford that.
No, we can't afford that. We need that water that's leaking in Flint in my district. Yeah. Thank you.
Gentlelady's time has expired. At this time, Chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Administrator McCarthy, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.
As you know, America's brick industry, brick and tile industry is struggling in our
current economy. It's made up largely of small family-owned businesses that have been in business for generations and for the most part are, in many cases, are the only source of employment in the communities in which they reside, where they provide jobs and a tax base for their communities. The House recently passed bipartisan legislation that would impose a legislative stay of the BRIC-MAC rule pending judicial review. Administrator McCarthy, is the EPA willing to provide an administrative stay to protect these small businesses, especially given what happened to this industry before the rule was vacated in 2007, after they had already come into full compliance with a previous rule in 2003?
Well,
From
sir,
2003.
we actually think that when we met with small businesses, we did, I think, a good job at listening to the flexibility they needed in the rule itself. We provided very flexible options for smaller businesses so they could comply. We actually gave maximum time as well for compliance. So we believe that the rule as written should continue to move through the courts, and hopefully we will have that on the books because it yields significant reductions in toxic pollutants in a way that we think even small businesses can manage.
Yeah, I want to get to that aspect of it in a moment, but here's the problem. The industry doesn't see it the way that you just described it.
Yeah.
They spent hundreds of millions of dollars to comply with the 2003 rule, only to have it set aside by the courts in 2007. Then when the EPA started formulating this new BRIC-MAC, they started with a baseline of where the 2007 rule that was set aside ended off, giving the industry very little credit for the accomplishments of the reductions that they had achieved with the hundreds of millions of dollars that they had invested for control technology between 2003 and 2007. So here they are again, under stress. I mean, there's only about 7,000 jobs in America attributed to the brick industry. The industry is telling us that many of these small businesses will close down, and here's the real crux of the issue. We don't import brick in America. We've got a brick and tile industry that make our construction materials. We don't import it from anybody else. I mean, unless we want to start making buildings and homes out of sticks and straw, we better figure this out, because these companies cannot continue to stand up under this duress. And we're not suggesting that we not move forward with the rule. We're just suggesting that we delay the rule, administrative stay, work with your department to do that until the judicial reviews are completed. If the courts say, fine, go ahead, then we have something else to talk about. But that seems to be the prudent thing to do, rather than put this industry through another round of egregious compliance that the courts could come back and set aside, but then the damage will have been done again, and we may lose a lot of our brick manufacturing capability.
Well, sir, I think the administration has also already submitted a SAP indicating that we really don't want to give up what amounts to 30 tons of reduction of toxic emissions.
So they're willing to give up. They're willing to give up bricks and our ability to build buildings and homes for that.
No, sir, we think that small businesses have been given enough flexibility in the rule as it's been designed, but I certainly understand your concerns.
We disagree.
And however Congress and the President move this forward, we'll certainly abide by it.
Well, we disagree strongly. Your agency has recently proposed an update to the cross-state air pollution rule. Many states and stakeholders have raised concerns about the feasibility of implementing EPA's proposal, especially within a short period of time. It's got a proposed implementation of this summer or summer of 2017. So has your department, your agency, done a specific analysis of this latest proposal on the reliability of the electricity grid? And if not, why not?
I certainly know that we've done a regulatory impact assessment on this rule. This rule it used to be called the Cross-State Air Pollution Rule. I think we still do call it that. But this is an actually very sophisticated and should be very successful trading program. So it does provide lots of flexibilities to get these reductions, and it is a rule that we just proposed. We're in the comment period. We certainly want to take cognizance of the comments that come in and anticipate any adjustments that are necessary before the rule might be finalized.
I know I'm over my time, Mr. Chairman, but would the EPA consider reproposing this rule given the concerns that have been raised about the likely unworkability of the proposal?
Well, we just proposed it, sir. It's going to be important for us to see what the comments look like when they come in.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. This time, the chair recognizes the gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. DeGette, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Administrator McCarthy, for coming over today. In 2005, when Congress passed the Energy Act, they exempted hydraulic fracturing from the Safe Drinking Water Act, as you know. And in 2009, our former colleague Maurice Henchy and I, we secured funding for the EPA to study the effects of hydraulic fracturing on drinking water. Up to that date, the research on fracking was very limited, and it mostly consisted of reviews of similarly limited literature. So especially being from Colorado, where we have a lot of fracking going on, I thought it was important that we understood the impacts of hydraulic fracturing on drinking water. Now, so last June, the agency issued a draft version of the assessment, and it found that there were mechanisms by which hydraulic fracturing activities could impact drinking water resources. But then, at the same time, the press release and the executive summary that came out also prominently stated that hydraulic fracturing has not led to, quote, wide systematic impacts, end quote, to the drinking water of the United States. I was frankly surprised in this draft, or in the press release, that it would say that, because the study that we authorized was designed to develop the understanding of specific ways that contamination could occur with hydraulic fracturing. Frankly, I'm glad that we haven't had wide systematic impacts, but it doesn't matter whether we have had it if it could occur. And so what we were trying to do is to say, figure out the preliminary research that could characterize currently little understood or unknown pathways to contaminating of drinking water from hydraulic fracturing, not in broad proclamations. And then in the draft version of the study, the EPA said, quote, the limited amount of data collected before and during hydraulic fracturing activities reduces the ability to determine whether hydraulic fracturing affected drinking water resources in cases of alleged contamination, end quote. And then the Scientific Advisory Board, charged with reviewing the study, agreed that the broad declarations in the summary and press materials, quote, are presented ambiguously and are inconsistent with the observations, data, and levels of uncertainty presented in the report. So basically, this preliminary version that was released last June, it just created even more confusion, which is what we've had since 2005. And so what I'm worried about is that the EPA doesn't know still and cannot estimate still what the potential impacts of drinking water contamination are. The assessment identifies several mechanisms by which a spill, leak, or migration of hydraulic fracturing fluids could potentially contaminate drinking water, but the scope of the study didn't have the EPA evaluate how those events would affect human health. So, pretty soon here, I'm hoping in the next few months, the EPA will release the final report, and I'm hoping what it will do is more clearly emphasize the risk to the real scientific risk to drinking water resources and what we can do, how we can get that data to ensure that our drinking water is safe. Anyway, you might want to comment on that.
Well,
in 1 minute and 4 seconds.
My only comment is I think that it was clearly a necessary study for us to do. I think very often when we put out a science study, people will pick and choose certain sentences in it. you know, basically we said we didn't have evidence of widespread systemic impacts to drinking water, but we clearly did identify that there are potential mechanisms in the water system where impacts could occur, but there were also opportunities for offsetting those by taking the right preventive measures.
Right.
Like looking at how you construct a well, understanding your groundwater flow and pattern before you even consider inserting hydrofrac fluid into the groundwater.
Right.
Or below the groundwater. So there's challenges here, but we did suffer from having little real data, significant amounts of data, to more effectively be able to speak with certainty about what was going on.
Well, I'm just hoping that when you all issue the final results of the study, that you can clearly say where the gaps still are, because that's exactly why we need the study, to be able to say how you can do fracking in a safe and a way that protects our drinking water, which I think it can happen, but we need to get that data to know how.
In many ways, we're relying on states like Colorado.
Thank you. Okay, thank you.
Gentlelady's time's expired. At this time, Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Hudson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Administrator McCarthy, for joining us today. Madam Administrator, I'm sure you're familiar with the EPA's proposed rule released last July that proposed new greenhouse gas standards for medium and heavy-duty trucks.
Yes, sir.
Are you aware that in the middle of that proposed rule, there's a proposal by EPA to make it illegal to modify vehicles used solely for competition?
No, sir, I don't believe that that's what it says, but I certainly understand the section that you're talking about.
Well, I can read the language to you. It says certified motor vehicles and motor vehicle engines and their emission control devices must remain in their certified configuration, even if they're used solely for competition or if they become non-road vehicles or engines. It seems pretty clear to me. In your opinion, are owners of vehicles that have been modified so they can be used for competition now in violation of the law?
Sir, there is a clear exemption in the statute that addresses NASCAR and other professional raceways and why we do not regulate those vehicles. I think we were very directly trying to make sure that we are doing no more than what we've done before in terms of either compliance or enforcement. And we're trying to recognize that exemption in that rule. Now, I fully recognize that this has raised a lot of confusion, and we need to address this confusion moving forward, because there is no way. NASCAR's been a great partner of EPA. They do great work on biofuels. The last thing I want to do is alienate them, that's for sure.
I appreciate that, but NASCAR is one facet,
Yes.
But what about your man or woman who likes to take a car in their backyard and fix it up and take it down a local drag strip and race it? I mean, that kind of modification, it appears very clearly, is now ruled out.
Well, we have never, ever enforced on an individual of that nature. What we're trying to do is get at manufacturers of these devices that they sell and make sure that they sell them only for competitive, dedicated vehicles, because it's really challenging to us to make sure that the certified vehicles remain in compliance with air regulations.
Well, I appreciate what you're saying, but it says here, emission control devices must remain in a certified configuration even if they're used solely for competition. I mean, it sounds different. The rule sounds different from what you're explaining.
We'll do the very best we can. We actually we've had substantial amounts of discussion. Whatever we can do to clarify this, we're going to be able to take those steps.
Well, I think taking the word solely used for competition out.
I'll have to see it in its entirety. I'm not a lawyer. I appreciate the need to use common sense language. I know that what I've told you is what our intent was. We will make sure that the language matches that.
Okay, well, I certainly appreciate that, because not only is this an important part of the way of life for a lot of Americans who enjoy taking cars and modifying them so they can race, but it's a billion-dollar industry of aftermarket folks who make parts for people to use in competition. I remember back in February, you testified before the committee and you made the point that not one EPA regulations ever cost one job. Well, I'm telling you, this is a billion-dollar industry that would be wiped out if we can't clarify this and make sure the intent you've expressed is reflected in the regulation.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. That, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. This time, Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Dakota, Mr. Kramer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. McCarthy, for being with us. Ms. McCarthy, I have a couple of questions, maybe a statement and a request. Are you familiar, or how familiar are you with the series of enforcement actions that your agency is working with the DOJ on, using Section 114 to basically find consent, I guess, a consent decree with a number of North Dakota oil companies? How familiar are you with that
I am
action?
somewhat familiar with it, sir.
Yeah, does it seem like it makes sense to use consent decree or to bully, if you will, my term, bully, and many companies' terms, by the way, bully companies into some sort of agreement apart from a transparent process?
Well, actually, sir, settlement agreements are reached in order to get compliance and make it easier for both the industry as well.
Let me ask, are you familiar with a memo from Cynthia Giles from your office, the enforcement shop, to regional directors where she discusses the EPA's plan of, quote, innovative enforcement to force upon companies the compliance tools that go well beyond regulations and laws as they currently exist? Are you familiar with that memo?
I'm not sure what.
Are you familiar with the term innovative enforcement?
Well, what we actually are using a lot of innovation to make sure that we can use our resources wisely, take advantage of new technologies that are out there.
Okay, technologies such as perhaps FLIR cameras. Are you familiar with the use of FLIR cameras to capture images of methane gas escaping? Sure. Do you know that FLIR cameras do not measure the amount of methane that's being leaked from a?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so how do you then justify going to a company and saying you're not in compliance based on this FLIR camera, which does not measure the amount of the emission, and then I guess threaten them with a fine of several $1,000s per day since the construction? Are you familiar with threats of fines of millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, even multiple billions of dollars against companies?
I am aware that we have reached settlements with using that as a screen.
You've not reached any settlement in North Dakota with an oil company yet. You have with Noble and a gas company, very different than oil, in Colorado. Colorado, a non-attainment state. North Dakota, an attainment state. My point is this. Here's what's, by attainment, you seem confused. That means attaining, meeting the compliance. You're complying with your ambient air quality standards. North Dakota does that. My point is this. This is a state health department issue, in my view, not an EPA issue. North Dakota is a compliant state, not a non-compliant state. Our industry, in response to early notices from the EPA, well over a year ago, nearly 2 years ago now, our state health department, our oil and gas division, which operates under the North Dakota Industrial Commission, which is 3 elected officials, the governor, attorney general, and the commissioner of agriculture, working with industry, came up with a comprehensive plan, a global plan to deal with 100% of the emissions. Your agency, ignoring that rather than participating in that, has picked one company at a time. They're now somewhere around half a dozen to a dozen companies to try and find consent, in other words, admission of guilt of something that I don't believe they're guilty of, by using this innovative enforcement activity. And I find it, frankly, reprehensible. Frankly, I find it illegal. But when companies are forced, especially with $40 a barrel oil to less, forced to either pay millions of dollars in attorney's fees to fight this or comply or consent, sometimes it's cheaper to consent. And I don't think that's an appropriate regulatory regime, quite honestly. And I would rather see, here's what I'd like in the last minute. I want to ask you this closing question, and I'm looking for a really good answer. Will you commit today to, instead of using these 114, this bullying tactic, again, my term, extortion tactics, would you instead work with our state and work with our health department, work with our industrial commission, our oil and gas division, and our industry who wants to comply 100%, they all want to comply, work with them on a global solution that actually reaches attainment rather than a fine or a penalty? How about we do that? You agree to that today, and we'll have a great
Sir, 114 is an information collection request.
Yes, it is.
I mean, and the tool that you're talking about is a screening mechanism that asks the question whether or not we think there may be significant violations of emissions of volatile organic compounds. And that's why you ask for the information from the companies. I wouldn't characterize it as a bullying tactic.
Well, except when that information is used to try and extort huge fines.
No, it's used to see whether or not they're in compliance, and that has nothing to do with non-attainment. That has to
Explain
do with
that to the DOJ attorneys. My time has expired.
Well, I appreciate you raising that issue because all of us have heard about that issue, and I'm glad that he brought it to your attention.
Could I just mention, and we're certainly happy we are in discussions with the state of North Dakota on this and would love to be able to.
Well, we could save a lot of your budget money if we just let the state handle it. That would be.
This time, Chair will recognize the gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Elmers, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Ms. McCarthy and Mr. Bloom, for being here today for this subcommittee hearing. Administrator McCarthy, the 2015 ozone standards immediately apply to pre-construction permits that businesses need to grow and create jobs. That means businesses will have to immediately show their projects meet the 2015 ozone standard, something that may be hard to demonstrate in an area that it is or may be going into non-attainment status. What pre-construction permitting relief will EPA provide for areas in this situation?
I'm sorry, what pre-construction, what did you say?
What pre-construction permitting relief will the EPA provide for areas in this situation? What are the options for non-attainment status area for pre-construction permitting?
Right. The non-attainment designation isn't even going to be made until 2017. So we are working with states to make sure that they understand what their attainment status might look like, but there is a fairly lengthy process. We work back and forth with the governor of each state to identify non-attainment areas.
Okay, so that does not go into effect until 2017.
We haven't even finished collecting the data that would go into determining non-attainment yet. That's through 2016.
Okay, so the Obama administration pledged the United States would reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. Were you consultant? Was the EPA consulted on that, or how did the president come up with that number by 2025?
This has to do with reductions of greenhouse gases nationally. That is a determination that's made by the White House in consultation with all of the agencies, including EPA, that look at what existing authority we have, what is planned, what's reasonable, and what's achievable.
So can you explain that process then? So you're saying the EPA was involved. Number one, what other agencies were involved? And describe that process to us of how that became the determining number.
Actually, I wasn't involved in the calculation of that number. EPA's job was to look at our regulatory authority, what we thought was reasonable and achievable under our existing authorities. We provided that information to the White House. Other agencies similarly did that, and that was the commitment, and the accounting was done behind that to submit for our commitment.
Was the public consulted on this beforehand?
I apologize.
No problem. Was the public? Was there a comment period for the public on this? I'm trying to find out how we came up with that number, and was there consideration of public comment?
I'm not aware of that process.
Okay. So the EPA. Well, I guess what I'm asking then is, can you provide for the committee what it was or the sources that the EPA used to I know you said with jurisdiction, the involvement of regulations and authority. Can you provide for the committee, what information you used to come up with the
reason I'm a little 25.
Not 2020.
So
okay. Well,
I could be wrong, but I'm just
okay.
having trouble
Questionable
filling it out.
2030.
Okay.
Okay, all right. I just want to, in the time I have left, I only have about 40 seconds left. EPA's budget document states that the Clean Power Plan is, quote, the president's highest priority for the EPA and the central element of the U.S. domestic climate mitigation agenda.
Yes.
Is the Obama administration's pledge to reduce emissions by 26 to 28% below 2005 levels contingent on the Clean Power Plan?
Well, the Clean Power Plan was a reflection of what we thought the direction of the energy transition was heading. What we're seeing already is that the energy transition is happening towards low carbon sources even more quickly than we had anticipated. So we fully expect the Clean Power Plan, when it's looked at on its merits, will be found to be legally solid. And we don't think we're going to lose any ground in terms of our ability to make those commitments real.
Okay, so just in closing, because I'm actually over time, you don't believe that any of that there will be a delay further at the court level as far as the Clean Power Plan goes?
I think we will, that the Clean Power Plan will be found to be legally solid, and it will move forward, and that we will not be in a position to have lost ground in the end when it is fully implemented.
Thank you very much, and I yield back.
This time, Chair recognizes the gentleman from Indiana, Dr. Bouchon, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Sorry.
I'm sorry.
No, I just told him to pause my time while you had to get some counsel from your staff.
Yep.
A couple of things. First of all, earlier in your testimony, you mentioned carbon capture and sequestration facility sites that are working in the United States. Can you give me the name and the address of all of those places that are,
happy to do that.
and whether or not they're in continuous operation?
Yes.
Because that I'm aware of, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, that there aren't any, and there was, you know, there's a couple of one in Illinois and one up in Canada, and that if there are some down in the South, maybe Louisiana, that are working. But I'd be interested in knowing, because you made it sound like this is a ubiquitous thing across the country, that carbon capture is
I do realize that.
Is working because
But it's used not just on coal facilities, on generating facilities. It has other applications where it's being used today.
Okay, so are there any coal facilities that it's working on right now today?
I believe it's in Kemper here, and I believe there is a dam in Canada where it's being fully utilized and is getting.
The one in Canada is going broke, by the way, and the one in Illinois.
And Kemper's not operating.
Kemper's not operating. So
okay.
The reality is that was a misleading, I think, to say that carbon capture and sequestration when we were talking about coal-fired power plants is commercially viable. In Indiana, I have every coal mine in the state, so to my knowledge, you know, it's not commercially viable or economically viable to implement that in Indiana. If it was, I would be in favor of it being on all of our coal-fired power plants. I'm just so you know, I agree the Earth's temperature is changing. I agree that with technology and innovation, we should always be advancing how we use all of our fuels. I agree with that premise. What I don't agree with is federal agencies setting regulations that can't be met with current technology, and that's what this is doing. So with that said, I'm going to change course a little bit and talk about athletic fields.
Okay.
We've noticed, I think, in recent media reports in the press about alleged potential adverse health effects on young people might experience from playing on crumb rubber athletic fields. Almost 2 months after the committee sent you a letter asking a number of questions about this situation, Dr. Thomas Burke signed a letter stating that although the EPA was aware of the number of studies that showed no elevated health risks, the studies are limited and did not comprehensively address the concerns about risks to children's health from these exposures. Yes. EPA then said that in order to fill in the gaps, it was planning to work with the state of California on a comprehensive evaluation of tire crumb. Ultimately, the EPA decided not to work with California and now is collaborating with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Consumer Product Safety Commission on a one-year study. So the question I have is, what changed the EPA's mind about this working with California? And I mean, I'm just genuinely interested in getting the information so that all of us can make an assessment of whether this is or is not a problem for kids.
I appreciate that. Part of the challenge that we were facing was that some of the studies, the earlier studies that had been done, really weren't looking at the material that's being used currently in those fields. That we're finding that the material themselves, is those small balls that are being used, actually have an opportunity for potential exposures that we hadn't really looked at. And the materials themselves are changing. So we felt that it was prudent, given the concerns, to just take a look at it, because the material itself is changing, how it's being utilized is different, and we thought we should at least close the loop to make sure that there weren't human exposure potentials that we hadn't yet evaluated.
Great, I appreciate it. What kind of, so the study is a 1 year, you're planning on 1 year study of the health
We're hoping
impacts?
to have a good data by the end of this year.
Okay, so you're going to be, tell me the kind of description of because I was a healthcare provider before I was a doctor, and sometimes it takes many years to determine the health impacts. If you do a study for a year, maybe I'm misstating. You do a study for a year, and then you may not know what the health impacts are for 5 or 10 years later. You know, if some who knows. I'm just kind of interested in the.
Well, you know, when we got together, we realized that there were studies being done, but people were concerned, and the scientists said the first question to look at is whether there is any potential exposure route. If I can't ingest it, if it can't get in my blood, if it can't get into my system. So this is really about identifying whether there is an exposure route.
That makes total sense.
And
Okay,
that's
so
what
it's
we're
just
gonna have
the
by
initial
late
study is
next
about
year.
exposure,
That's
only about
exactly
exposure,
right.
not.
It's not what that exposure results in
Okay.
terms of health impact.
Okay, that clarified it. Well, this seems to be a developing important issue related to athletic fields, and for not only for children but other athletes. And so I appreciate your work. Thank you for being here. I yield back.
And Mr.
Jim.
Chairman, I apologize. I raised confusion. I think it is 26 to 28% by 2025. I had a little brain freeze, so I just wanted to thaw it out while I had a moment.
Thank you very much for bringing that to our attention. This time I recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Mullen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator, thank you for being here today. I cannot imagine how bad your head must be hurting going through this entire line of questioning, but we do appreciate your time and your effort for being here. I have a couple of questions. On January 14th of this year, I sent a letter along with 14 other members who sat on this committee and subcommittees with 3 questions about your agency's plan to send U.S. federal employees overseas to help countries meet emission targets that were set at the Conference of Paris at the end of last year. We requested the answers by January 29th. It is now March 22nd, and we have yet to hear from anybody. Are you aware of this letter? Have you received this letter?
I'm sure the agency has. I will double check on the response. Is this specific to Paris, or is this
This is
more
specific
broad?
to Paris, to a statement that you made while speaking to send federal employees, EPA employees, over to other countries to help them identify emissions. Are you familiar with that?
Not particularly, but I'll certainly look at it.
You gave a speech at the Council of Foreign Relations, and you mentioned that the meetings that the EPA will deploy employees to certain countries to help these countries learn how to identify and measure sources of greenhouse gas emissions. The letter that we sent to you specifically asked 3 different questions. Now, one, I do have a letter here with me that I'll be happy to give to you, and I'd like to submit it also for record. I have a copy for you to have. It asks 3 questions, and those 3 questions, since you're here today, I'm going to go ahead and ask you. 1, how many U.S. federal employees will be deployed to participate in these countries?
I don't know the answer to that question, sir. I think you're referring to the work we do with the Department of State to do capacity building in other countries. Very often,
that may be true, but in your statement, you said that the EPA was going to deploy these.
EPA does do that, but we often get resourced from the Department of State for those activities.
So how many employees do you plan on sending? I mean, you're here today to talk about your budget, and I'm kind of concerned that the EPA is using taxpayer dollars to send employees to other countries to help them with a non-binding agreement that was set in Paris.
Well, the kind of resources that we have in our international unit is actually very small. If we want to utilize more for a purpose like this, which is our capacity building related to the Paris Agreement, then it usually is the Department of State provides us those direct resources.
Well, we have reached out personally from my office. The Oversight Committee has also reached out to 0 response. None.
Okay, sir.
Your office has yet to respond back to us. We asked for January 29th. And so once again, I'll ask these three questions. If you don't have the answers, I'd really appreciate you getting back to us
Okay.
in a timely manner,
Yes.
which hasn't happened so far. One was how many federal employees are going to be deployed. Second, how long will these employees be deployed? And third, what will the cost be to deploy?
Okay, sir, I'll go check on the response. And
Do you have any answers to that right now?
I do not know the answers to those questions.
Do you think it's appropriate to send individuals from the EPA that are being paid by taxpayer dollars from the United States to help countries meet a non-binding agreement?
Sir, we do work internationally because pollution knows no boundaries.
How much do you spend in the EPA working in other countries? Does the EPA, I mean, because we have a hard enough time dealing with you guys in the United States, much less in other countries.
We have very few resources in this regard, but we utilize them and
What are the
we spend
resources?
a lot of time training trainers in other countries to.
You say very little. What is that number? I mean, you're referring to a specific number by saying very little. How much is that number?
Well, let me tell you.
I would appreciate that.
This has to do with the total number of grants is less than 1%.
What is that 1%? What does that represent in dollar amounts?
1.6 million.
1.6, and that's not including what the State Department helps offset. Is that correct?
That would be our resources that the State Department would.
Can you give me?
Oh, I'm sorry. That includes State Department.
That includes the State Department?
Is that what you said?
Or come from other federal agencies.
Let me get back to you.
I'd appreciate the total numbers if you don't mind. I'm out of time, but I would like to make sure in a timely manner that you respond back to us, because once again, this is talking about budget and we're talking about dollars spent here.
And,
Thank you.
And also, I mean, that's a very good point. We would like to know the total dollar value of the grants given to other countries by EPA.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. At this time, the chair will recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Long, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ms. McCarthy, I understand that the EPA has set a standard of 70 parts per billion for the 2015 ozone standards. Does this mean that counties over 70 parts per billion will be designated as being in non-attainment, I think is the phrase you use, with the 2015 standards?
It means that we're looking at 2014, 15, and 16 using a specific formula to identify those that are in non-attainment.
But the ones that will be in non-attainment are the ones that are over 70 parts per billion, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Using that formula.
And will these counties become subject to new planning requirements like state implementations, plans, and other obligations?
Yes, sir.
Counties that are below 70 parts per billion will not be subject to these same planning requirements. Is that correct?
They may be subject to earlier requirements depending upon whether.
I'm not talking about earlier requirement. I'm talking about this requirement.
No, sir, they would not be.
Okay. The EPA has said that most areas will be in compliance with the 2015 standards by 2025 under existing regulations and programs. Once these counties meet the standards in 2025, will the non-attainment designation automatically be lifted, or is there a process for that also?
No, there is a process for that.
Okay, my understanding is that once an area is designated to be in non-attainment, it is locked into a complex bureaucratic process to meet these standards, followed by an additional 20 years of maintenance plan and oversight from the EPA. How is it that the county that is just over 70 parts per billion gets locked into a 20-year plus process, while similar counties just barely under 20 parts per billion do not have to undergo this process? Could you explain the wisdom of that to me?
I think that what we try to make sure that we do is to, when you are designated as non-attainment, we try to make sure that whatever actions the state took to drive down the pollution to that level and to achieve healthy air does not backslide. So it's just a question of maintaining those actions so that you can continue moving forward knowing that you've not only achieved it on a given date, but you don't backslide and start and start allowing emissions that would then drive you into non-attainment again.
But the ones that barely got under the 70 billion, do they have to worry about
No,
backsliding?
they don't, because we have determined that that is the level that we're seeking to achieve to provide healthy air, and there is no reason why legal reason why we would want them to do more. We want everybody to stay below that 70 level.
Is there any way to reduce the 20-year regulatory burden on counties that are just barely out of the window?
Well, we're talking to the states because I think there is an opportunity to streamline that process. And we're working with states all the time to try to make sure that we do that, to streamline the process of redesignating them as areas of attainment, and also that we make sure that we don't overburden them with this obligation for anti-backsliding. We know that states worked hard to get there. They don't want to backslide. We just want to make sure that we have a system in place that maintains that. But if there's ways in which we can streamline it, we certainly want to do it.
Okay, thank you. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. This time recognize the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Harper, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Administrator McCarthy. I know it's been a long day. We thank you for coming, though, to help us understand some of these issues in a better manner. The Clean Power Plan includes various compliance deadlines for states, ranging from September of this year, when plans would have been due, through 2030. Assuming that the rule is upheld, won't each deadline under the rule be extended by the amount of time for completion of judicial review?
Well, that's not actually what the Supreme Court said, but we assume that the courts will make that judgment over time, or leave that to EPA to make their own judgment. It's usually spoken to, but not at this stage.
Well, let me ask you, are you aware that in the filings submitted to the Supreme Court, that the Solicitor General explicitly said that the effect of the stay would be to toll every sequential step in the rule's implementation?
I think what he was speaking to was that the request for a stay included that in it, but the Supreme Court did not choose to make that determination. They simply said that it would be stayed until it made its way back, and we expect that it will be there in due time, and that the courts will either speak to that or give it to EPA to make that determination. But I don't know what choice they're going to make until they go and make it.
Sure. The Solicitor General also said that granting the stay, and I'm quoting what he said, would toll all of the rule's deadlines, even those that do not come due until many years after the case would be resolved. For the period of time between the rule's publication and the ultimate disposition of this suit, was the Solicitor General right or wrong?
No, he was speaking to the full breadth of what folks were looking for who were seeking a stay, but the Supreme Court didn't speak to that issue. The only thing they spoke to was the stay of the rule. They didn't speak to any tolling or what it meant in terms of compliance timelines.
Sure. Are you encouraging states and utilities to continue to work with EPA in the event that the rule is upheld?
We're certainly encouraging states to continue to look at where their energy system is moving forward, and we have made ourselves available to states that voluntarily want to keep looking at their implementation options, and we'll keep working with them on that, but we certainly won't do anything that implements or enforces the rule consistent with what the Supreme Court stay dictates.
The point of the stay was to protect the economic interests of states and stakeholders, regardless of whether the rule is overturned. So you appear to be signaling to states that they must continue to take action and expend resources, and signaling to utilities that they must respond to the potential rule, which appears to undermine the purpose of the stay. If you can't respect the purpose of the Supreme Court stay, it appears that Congress may have to take steps to come in and prevent you from taking any action that effectively undermines the stay.
Well, as I've said, sir, EPA is not dictating any implementation of this rule or telling any state they have to do anything.
And
We're just offering an ability to support them as we always do.
So that's not happening in any conversations with any utilities that you're aware of?
No, not that I'm aware of, sir.
In your testimony, you state, although the Supreme Court has stayed the Clean Power Plan rule, the stay does not preclude all continued work on the CPP. Has EPA discontinued any of its previously planned activities relating to the Clean Power Plan since the stay was issued? And if they have, what activities have been discontinued?
Well, we have been working with the Department of Justice, and it's very clear we have discontinued our implementation and enforcement of the rule. What we have not discontinued is our willingness to work with states that want to voluntarily keep moving forward to look at planning, but we certainly are not indicating to states that we expect to see their preliminary plans come in or that they should be working on those at this point in time.
Has there been any action to encourage the utilities or states to continue to work with you? Any incentives or anything of any nature?
We have not provided any incentive for that, no.
Has EPA reassigned any of its staff to other projects as a result?
I can't answer that specifically. I don't manage the staff at that level.
Okay, I believe my time is close enough. I will yield back.
Gentleman yields back. This time, Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Flores, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator McCarthy, thank you for joining us today. In November of 2014, the EPA proposed a new, more stringent standard for ozone prior to finalizing the implementation standards for the standard last set in 2008. And in fact, what this did is it forced states to make decisions under a new standard without final implementation rules on the prior standard, all again coming from your agency. And so not only from an air quality standpoint, but also from an administrative standpoint, doesn't it make sense to permit the 2008 standard to be fully implemented prior to doubling down and creating a new standard?
Actually, that is not the way the law has been worked or has been implemented. The prior standards remain in place. Some states achieve those, and in fact, we've had great success in NOx reductions or our ozone compliance since we first started identifying health-based standards and moving forward. So we do not believe you have to. In fact, I don't think the law says that we're supposed to wait till one is done before we do and take a look at whether the health-based standard needs to be adjusted. It's required for us to look at that every 5 years, regardless of attainment status.
Well, but you rolled out a new set of rules at the same time, right after you rolled out the implementation standards for the 2008 rules. And so what you basically created is two sets of standards that states have to follow. The National Association of Clean Air Agencies testified to the EPA that the new ozone standard will have profound impact on the work of state and local air pollution control agencies, which differs from what you just said. Did the EPA assess the impact that implementing the new ozone standards would have on state and local agencies that were already trying to implement the 2008 standard?
We did look at that impact, sir, and we did a cost-benefit analysis of that, and we determined that the benefits far exceeded the cost. But there is no question that it provides the need for both EPA and states to actually expend more resources, and for that reason, this budget includes both additional resources for EPA for that implementation, as well as a request that state resources be also boosted up as a result of this.
Would it make more sense for these standards to be harmonized so that you could flow from the 2008 standard to the 2015 standard? So instead of trying to worry about the dual implementation?
Well, sir, we'll do the best we can to make sure that we're not requiring duplication of the states as they move forward with their implementation planning.
Now, the EPA chose to project the cost of its new ozone standard to 2025. And since EPA bases its entire economic analysis on predicted 2025 air quality,
yes,
would the agency support extending compliance deadlines under the standards to 2025?
We have not considered that at this point, sir. We're actually following the statutory timelines.
In the budget, EPA has requested funding for implementation of new national ambient quality standards. Got two parts to this question. One, when will EPA begin the process of implementing the 2015 standards?
We are already in the process of providing guidance to the states on that. We have yet to complete 2016 and see what that data looks like, because the actual attainment decisions Non-attainment decisions are based on 14, 15, and 16 data. And then we have the process of working with governors from that point forward to see where the non-attainment areas they would suggest. Then we look at those. So we were talking about non-attainment designations in 2017. That's when we also make determinations on what type of how difficult the attainment process is, which dictates how quickly attainment needs to be achieved, and then that's how they do their state implementation plans to coordinate with achieving those reductions in those timelines.
Right, but when you established the last set of standards in 2008,
yes.
It almost immediately, EPA almost immediately began reviewing that standard, but it didn't finalize the implementation for 7 years, till 2015. So shouldn't we have a system where we prioritize implementation of the existing regulations before we expand resources on a new implementation?
Well, I think the way we look at it, and you're right, we should be avoiding duplication as much as possible or any extra work, but it's almost as if we now know what the health-based goal is, and getting there is the challenge. And the fact that we get partway there with one decision and further along with another is not shifting direction. It's all moving to the direction of healthy air.
I would submit that you have created a lot of confusion in the real world, and that's something that, you and I are going to disagree on that. I'm going to throw out one last thing. I sent you a letter on May 29th of last year regarding the regional haze plan for Texas. I got a letter from the Region 6 director about 2 months later in 2015, and he said he couldn't comment on anything because you were in the rulemaking process. I never did get a follow-up to that letter, so I'd like, now that you've completed your rulemaking for the Regional Haze project, I'd like to get a follow-up letter to answer the 6 questions I put in my May 29th letter.
Yes, sir.
From 2015. So, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Jim yields back, and that concludes the questions today. Ms. McCarthy, I just want to make a couple of comments, and Mr. Tonko may or may not want to make some summary statements. First of all, I think anyone that's worked with you like you, because you have a great personality and you're effective at what you do. But I think you also recognize that America really is a divided country today. I mean, there really is a red and blue America. And one of the reasons, certainly not the only reason, but one of the reasons, those of us on our side of the aisle, when we go back to our districts, a common theme that we hear is the excess authority and pushing us, for lack of a better word, of EPA. And that comes about for a lot of different reasons. The Clean Power Plan being one of those. Congress had nothing to do with that. Now, I recognize that many on the left side of this dais support it. But that was initiated by the executive branch, entered into international agreements, non-binding, and the EPA has been driven because of that. 27 states filed lawsuits to try to delay it. I talked in my opening statement about BRIC MAC. You all lost that in U.S. Court of Appeals. The Utility MAC, the tailoring rule, the Clean Energy Plan. So many people out there in the country say, here's EPA going right down the road trying to accomplish their goals set by this administration without a lot of input from the Congress, and many times being overruled by the courts. Now, I recognize that a stay is not a decision on the substantive part of the rule, but it's a probability, or they would not have issued the stay. So I just want to point out that you all have the Clean Air Act, you have the Clean Water Act. All of us want to protect the environment, but I just want you to know personally that there are many people out there who do feel that EPA particularly is being overly aggressive. And I don't know what the final outcome of that's going to be, but it's something that should concern all of us. And like I said, America is divided. There's no question about that. We know that. But I want to thank you for spending the entire day testifying before the Appropriations Committee, our committee, about your budget. We appreciate your willingness to work with us, and we will be submitting the individual requests that members have made about additional information they've requested, and we'll keep the record open for 10 days here for additional comments, and I'll recognize Mr. Tonko for whatever time he might want to.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the hearing, and thank you, Administrator, for joining us and for all of your cooperation and for your leadership. Rather than focusing on our divided nation, I will talk about a united nation that is united in its need for clean water. It affects every life. It affects every job. And so we look forward to working with you and EPA on advancing clean drinking water as an outcome that provides resources to our states and local governments. And will have a strong outcome, I think, for both residential opportunities, families and children, and for businesses alike. So thank you again.
Thank you, Mr. Tonko, and that concludes today's hearing, and thank you again.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Tell Henry I said hello.
Okay, I will. I will. Thank you.